January 17, 1991, Desert Storm. The night sky over the Iraqi desert exploded with anti-aircraft fire. Searchlights swept across clouds of sand and smoke, seeking targets in the darkness. Through his thermal sight, Captain Frank Harrington watched the enemy's T-72 tanks arranged in defensive formation. His stomach tightened, as it always did before combat, that familiar mixture of fear and focus that had kept him alive through countless engagements. Wolfpack, this is Bull Leader. 4 T-72s confirmed at Grid Sierra Echo 437982. Prepare to engage on my mark. Inside the M1 Abrams tank, the air hung heavy with the scent of diesel and sweat. Harrington's crew worked in practiced silence. Jake Martinez, his gunner, adjusted the targeting system with small, precise movements. Sam Wilson, the loader, had already chambered a 120mm Sabot round. Bobby Thompson, his driver, kept the tank steady despite the uneven terrain. Wolfpack 2 and 3, flank east. Wolfpack 4, follow me. We'll draw their fire. The Iraqi tanks had not yet spotted them. A rare advantage. Harrington knew it wouldn't last. Distance to target, 2,100 meters. Wind from the west at 15 knots. Jake made the final adjustments. Target acquired. On my mark, 3, 2, 1, fire. The Abrams shuddered as the main gun discharged, the sound deafening even through their helmets. Before the shell had reached its target, Sam was already loading the next round. Through the sight, Harrington watched the first Iraqi tank erupt in flames, its turret blown completely off. Target destroyed, shifting to second T-72. The element of surprise was gone. Return fire kicked up sand around them. Bobby expertly maneuvered the 60-ton beast, never staying in one position long enough to become an easy target. They're calling in reinforcements, the radio crackled. Wolfpack 2 reporting multiple contacts approaching from the north. Harrington quickly assessed the situation. His 4 tanks versus an unknown number of enemy forces. The mission was to secure this sector, but not at the cost of his men. Jake, target the command vehicle. Sam, load heat round. As Jake locked onto the target, an explosion rocked their tank. Warning lights flashed across the control panel. The Abrams had taken a direct hit to the left track. Status report, Harrington demanded. Left track damaged. Hydraulic system compromised. We're immobile, sir. Bobby's voice remained calm despite the severity of their situation. Wolfpack 3 reporting hit. Heavy damage, 2 crew wounded. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Harrington faced an impossible choice. Stay and fight with disabled tanks, or abandon their positions and retreat. All units, this is Bull Leader. Continue engagement. Wolfpack 4, extract Wolfpack 3's wounded. Wolfpack 2, provide covering fire. Harrington opened his hatch and climbed out, exposing himself to enemy fire to get a better view of the battlefield. Tracer rounds zipped past him as he surveyed the terrain. His tank was disabled, but the gun still worked. If they could hold this position long enough for the rest of his company to arrive, they might survive. Sir, get back inside, Jake shouted. A shell exploded nearby, showering Harrington with sand and shrapnel. Blood trickled down his face from a cut above his eye, but he barely noticed. He spotted a depression about 50 meters to their east, a perfect defensive position for the wounded crew of Wolfpack 3. Bobby, radio coordinates Sierra Echo 438984 to Wolfpack 4. Tell them to position the wounded there. Jake, keep engaging those T-72s. Sam, prepare to defend against infantry. They'll be coming soon. For the next 20 minutes, Harrington's disabled tank continued firing, destroying 2 more enemy vehicles. The Iraqis, confused by the Americans' refusal to retreat despite their damaged tanks, hesitated in their advance. That hesitation cost them dearly. When the rest of the company finally arrived, they found Harrington standing atop his tank, directing fire despite his wounds. All 4 of his tanks had survived. 17 enemy vehicles lay destroyed across the battlefield. Later, as medics tended to his injuries, his commanding officer approached. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen, Captain. You should have retreated. Harrington looked up, his face streaked with blood and soot. With all due respect, sir, retreat wasn't an option. Not while my men were still on that field. The memory faded as Frank Harrington blinked in the bright sunlight. 34 years had passed since that night in the Iraqi desert. The sounds of ceremonial bagpipes brought him back to the present, to the parade grounds of Fort Moore, formerly known as Fort Benning. He stood at attention, his dress uniform still fitting well, despite his 62 years, as the Army band played. Today was his official retirement ceremony. 40 years of service, 4 decades of duty, honor, and sacrifice. And now it was over. Colonel Harrington's distinguished career spans multiple conflicts. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers. From Operation Desert Storm to Operation Iraqi Freedom, from peacekeeping missions in Bosnia to counter-insurgency operations in Afghanistan, Colonel Harrington has exemplified the highest traditions of the United States Army. Frank barely heard the words. His mind was on the faces of the men he'd served with, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't. In the front row sat his old crew. Jake Martinez, now with silver hair and reading glasses, but still with the same sharp eyes that had made him the best gunner in the battalion. Sam Wilson, who'd lost his left leg in their second tour in Iraq but never lost his spirit. Bobby Thompson, who'd gone on to become a tank commander himself before retiring 5 years earlier. They were his family as much as any blood relation. For his final assignment, Colonel Harrington served as the senior tactical advisor at the Armor Training Center, where he shaped the next generation of armored warfare specialists. His legacy lives on in the hundreds of officers and enlisted personnel he has trained and mentored throughout his career. Frank's gaze drifted to the gleaming M1 Abrams tank on display at the edge of the parade ground. The latest version was a far cry from the tanks he'd first commanded, with advanced electronics and composite armor that would have seemed like science fiction back in 1991. Yet the fundamentals remained the same: 4 crew members working in perfect coordination, bringing overwhelming firepower to bear on the enemy. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of his retirement medal. As the commanding general pinned it to his chest, Frank felt a strange emptiness. Tomorrow he would wake up as a civilian for the first time in 4 decades. The thought terrified him more than any enemy fire ever had. The reception afterward was filled with handshakes, backslaps, and war stories. Frank circulated through the crowd, accepting congratulations and reminiscing with old comrades. But his heart wasn't in it. This wasn't just the end of a career, it was the end of an identity. "You look like you're attending your own funeral," a gruff voice said behind him. Frank turned to find Lieutenant General Collins, his old friend and current commander of the U.S. Army Tank Automotive and Armaments Command. At 68, Collins was one of the few senior officers who outranked Frank in both grade and age. "Maybe I am, Pa," Frank replied with a wry smile. "The death of Colonel Harrington, reborn as Mr. Harrington." Collins chuckled. "The transition's not easy. I've got 2 more years before they put me out to pasture. Not looking forward to it myself." He gestured toward a quieter corner of the reception hall. "Got a minute? There's something I want to discuss with you." They found a secluded spot away from the crowd. Collins lowered his voice, his expression turning serious. "Have you been briefed on the Future Battlefield Initiative?" Frank nodded. "The Autonomous Combat Vehicle Program. I've seen the prototypes. It's moving faster than anyone expected. Congress approved full funding last month. Phase 1 deployment is scheduled for next fiscal year." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "That soon? I thought we were still at least 5 years out from operational capability." Collins shook his head. "The techs advanced rapidly. The latest generation of autonomous tanks outperform manned vehicles in 9 out of 10 combat scenarios. The writing's on the wall, Frank. The era of the tank crew is coming to an end." The news shouldn't have been surprising. Frank had been hearing about autonomous vehicles for years, had even consulted on some of the early designs. But he'd always believed there would be a place for human operators, at least in his lifetime. What about the human element? Split-second moral judgments, adaptability to unexpected situations? All being addressed by the latest AI systems, Collins interrupted. The new models can process information and make tactical decisions far faster than any human crew. They don't get tired, don't get scared, don't make mistakes due to emotion or fatigue. Frank thought about the night in Iraq when he'd refused to retreat despite damaged tanks. Would an AI have made the same decision? Would it have understood that sometimes victory comes not from perfect tactical execution, but from the human spirit, from refusing to abandon your comrades even against overwhelming odds? "I didn't come here to debate the merits of the program," Collins continued. "What's done is done. I'm here because I have a proposition for you." "I'm listening." "The 67th Armored Regiment is being deactivated next month. Its tanks will be the last M1A2s in active service before the transition to autonomous vehicles." Frank felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The 67th was his old unit, the Iron Tigers, with a lineage stretching back to World War II. The thought of it being deactivated, its proud history relegated to the archives, was almost unbearable. They're shipping these tanks to allies or museums, Collins explained. But before that happens, there's a final training rotation scheduled. One last class of tank commanders to be certified on the M1A2 platform. What does this have to do with me? I'm retired as of today. Collins smiled for the first time since they'd begun the conversation. On paper, yes, but I've been authorized to offer you a temporary position as a civilian contractor, special advisor to the 67th for its final training mission. You want me to help train the last class of tank commanders in U.S. Army history? Not just train them, lead them. These aren't fresh recruits, Frank. They're a mix of experienced NCOs and officers being retrained for staff positions after the transition, along with a few wounded warriors completing their rehabilitation before medical retirement. The Army wants to make this final class something special, a proper send-off for an era of warfare that's coming to an end. Frank was silent for a long moment. The proposition was both tempting and painful, to be part of the final chapter of the American Tank Corps, to help write the conclusion to a story he'd been part of for 40 years. It was an honor. But it also meant being the one to turn out the lights, to close the door on everything he'd dedicated his life to. Who's commanding the training cadre? He asked finally. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Reed. Another surprise. Mark Reed had been one of his most promising young officers 15 years ago, a natural tank commander with excellent tactical instincts. Frank had mentored him personally, had written the recommendation that sent Reed to the Command and General Staff College. Reed's good, one of the best I trained. Why do you need me? Collins's expression darkened. Reed's changed. He's fully embraced the autonomous vehicle program, has become one of its most vocal advocates. He sees this final training rotation as a formality, a sentimental gesture to appease the old guard before moving on to what he considers the real future of armored warfare. And you disagree? I think the human element still matters, Frank. Maybe not to the bean counters or the tech companies building these autonomous systems, but to the soldiers who will have to fight alongside them. I want someone there who understands that, who can give these last tank commanders something more than just technical training. I want someone who can pass on the intangibles, the things that can't be programmed into an AI. Frank gazed across the reception hall at the younger officers and NCOs in attendance. They looked at tanks differently than his generation had. To them, a tank was just another weapon system, a platform for delivering firepower. They hadn't experienced what Frank and his contemporaries had, the unique brotherhood that formed inside those steel beasts, the brishin that came from entrusting your life to 3 other men in a space the size of a walk-in closet. When does the rotation start? He asked. 2 weeks at the National Training Center, Fort Irwin, the Mojave Desert. One last deployment to a training ground designed to mimic the conditions in Iraq. It seemed fitting somehow. I'll do it, Frank said finally. But I want my old crew with me. Jake, Sam, and Bobby. If we're going to teach the last class what it really means to be a tank crew, I want the best instructors available. Collins smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Their contracts are already drawn up, pending your acceptance. You were that sure I'd agree? I know you, Frank. You couldn't walk away from this if you tried. Not from a chance to make one final contribution, to ensure that when the history of American tank warfare is written, it ends the way it should. As they rejoined their reception, Frank's gaze was drawn once more to the M1A2 Abrams on display. In the late afternoon sun, its armor gleamed like burnished gold. For 40 years, tanks like that had been his home, his office, his sanctuary. The thought of a battlefield without them, without the men who crewed them, left an ache in his chest that no retirement ceremony could ease. But perhaps this final mission could provide some closure, a chance to pass on not just the technical skills of tank warfare, but its soul, the courage, the camaraderie, the code of honor that had defined tank crews since they first rolled across the battlefields of World War I. One last chance to ensure that even as technology marched forward, the human spirit that had animated those machines of war would not be forgotten. The following morning, Frank woke before dawn. Old habits died hard. 40 years of military routine had programmed his body to rise with the sun. He made coffee and stepped onto the porch of his small house just outside Columbus, Georgia. The air was crisp with early spring, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. His retirement paperwork sat unsigned on the kitchen table. Collins had arranged a 24-hour delay in processing, giving Frank time to officially accept the contract position before his military retirement became final. Once he signed those papers, his active duty career would truly be over. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Frank wasn't surprised to see the familiar pickup truck pulling into his driveway. Bobby Thompson had always been punctual. Bobby climbed out, moving with the slight stiffness of a man in his late 50s who'd spent too many years inside the confines of a tank. He carried a bakery box and a thermos. "Figured you'd be up," Bobby said by way of greeting. "Brought breakfast. Sam and Jake are on their way." Frank nodded toward the porch swing. "Coffee's fresh." They settled into a comfortable silence, two old soldiers who'd long ago passed the need for constant conversation. The rising sun painted the Georgia pines in gold and amber, promising a beautiful day. "Collins offered us a job," Frank said finally. Bobby nodded. "He called last night, said you were taking lead." "I haven't decided yet." "Bullshit." Bobby's weathered face creased in a smile. "You decided the minute he asked, same as the rest of us." Frank couldn't argue with that. The prospect of one final mission with his old crew was too tempting to refuse, despite the bittersweet nature of the assignment. "It's really happening, isn't it?" he asked. "The end of the tank corps as we know it." Bobby sipped his coffee before answering. "Been coming for years, ever since those drone strikes started replacing close air support." The writing was on the wall. "But tanks are different. The human element don't matter to the politicians or the defense contractors," Bobby interrupted. "All they see are the numbers. Autonomous vehicles don't need rest, don't need food, don't come home in body bags that look bad on the evening news." The crunch of more tires on gravel signaled the arrival of the others. Jake Martinez pulled up in a sensible sedan, while Sam Wilson followed in a modified SUV equipped for his prosthetic leg. The four men, Harrington's Tigers, as they'd been known during their time with the 67th, were reunited once again. They gathered on the porch, exchanging greetings and good-natured insults with the ease of men who had faced death together and lived to tell about it. Sam distributed donuts from the bakery box while Jake examined the retirement paperwork on the kitchen table. "Still unsigned," Jake observed. "Having second thoughts, Colonel." "Just considering my options," Frank replied. Sam snorted. "What options? You were born to be a soldier? What are you going to do, sell insurance, take up golf? Not with your short game." The familiar banter lifted Frank's spirits. These men knew him better than anyone, understood the struggle he faced in transitioning to civilian life. "Collins offered us one last mission," he said, "training the final class of M1A2 tank commanders before the 67th deactivates." "We know," Jake said. "We all got the calls last night. Wanted to hear it from you before we gave our answers." Frank looked at each man in turn. "It's your decision. We all earned our retirement. No one would blame you for turning it down." Bobby leaned forward. "Cut the crap, Frank. We're in, all of us. You think we'd let you handle this alone?" Jake nodded. "The 67th deserves a proper send-off, not some half-assed ceremonial training rotation overseen by officers who are already focused on the next big thing. Besides," Sam added, tapping his prosthetic leg, "I've got a personal stake in making sure these kids understand what it really means to be a tank crew. What we sacrificed, what we achieved. That's not something any AI can teach them." Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. With these men beside him, the mission ahead seemed not just possible but necessary. One final stand for the traditions and values they'd upheld throughout their careers. "There's something else you should know," he said. "The training cadre is commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Mark Reed." The name elicited various reactions. Jake frowned slightly, while Bobby's expression remained neutral. Sam was the only one who spoke. "Your former protege? The one who wrote that paper advocating for fully autonomous tank battalions?" Frank nodded. "The same. According to Collins, Reed sees this final rotation as a formality, a sentimental gesture before the real future of armored warfare takes over." "So we're walking into a situation where the commanding officer fundamentally disagrees with our entire purpose," Jake summarized. "Sounds familiar. Reminds me of that captain in Kuwait who thought tanks were obsolete after the Gulf War." "Captain Reynolds," Bobby recalled with a chuckle, "changed his tune pretty quick after that demonstration we ran." "Reed's different," Frank cautioned. "He's not against tanks per se. He just believes the future belongs to autonomous systems, and he's got the data to back it up. The latest tests show the AI-controlled versions outperforming human crews in most scenarios." "Most scenarios," Sam emphasized. "But not all. Let me guess. They excel in standard combat operations against conventional forces, perfect execution of textbook maneuvers. But what about the unexpected? Urban warfare with civilians present, ethical dilemmas where the right tactical decision might be the wrong moral one. Frank nodded. That's why Collins wants us there, to make sure these last tank commanders understand that being a tanker isn't just about hitting targets and executing maneuvers. It's about judgment, courage, camaraderie, the human elements that no AI can replicate. The four men fell silent, each contemplating the challenge ahead. It wasn't just about training a final class. It was about preserving a legacy, ensuring that even as technology marched forward, the spirit and traditions of the tank corps would not be forgotten. "Who's in this final class?" Jake asked eventually. Collins mentioned it was something special. Frank pulled out his phone where he'd downloaded the personnel files Collins had sent overnight. 12 students total, a mix of experienced NCOs and officers being retrained for staff positions, plus 4 wounded warriors completing their rehabilitation before medical retirement. Any standouts? Frank scrolled through the files. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, decorated for actions in Syria. Lieutenant Sarah Ramirez, previously with the 3rd Armored Division. Sergeant First Class Darius Washington, former Bradley commander, transitioning to Abrams. He paused as he reached the final name on the list. And Second Lieutenant Nathan Reed. Jake looked up sharply. Reed, any relation to the lieutenant colonel? His son, Frank confirmed. Recently commissioned through OCS, assigned to the 67th for his first posting. Bobby whistled low. That complicates things. The son of the man who thinks tanks are obsolete, learning to command one in the final class before they're all mothballed. Could be an opportunity, Sam suggested. If we can win over the son, maybe we influence the father. Frank wasn't so optimistic. Mark Reed had been stubborn, even as a young officer. If anything, the intervening years would have only hardened his convictions. But Sam was right about one thing. Nathan Reed could be a key factor in the success or failure of their mission. "There's one more thing you should know," Frank said, returning to the personnel files. "The class isn't just training on any tanks. They're being assigned the last 12 operational M1A2 SCPV-3s in the Army's inventory, tanks with actual combat history, and one of them is Tiger 01. The designation sent a jolt through the group. Tiger 01 had been their tank during their second tour in Iraq, the vehicle they'd been riding in when an IED took Sam's leg and nearly killed them all. None of them had seen the tank since being medevaced from the battlefield. "They rebuilt her," Sam said quietly, "after all this time." "Completely restored," Frank confirmed. "According to the files, she served with the 3rd Armored Division until last year, then was overhauled for this final training rotation. Apparently, someone thought it would be fitting for historically significant tanks to be part of this last class." The men exchanged glances. No words necessary to convey the emotions stirred by this revelation. Tiger 01 wasn't just a machine to them. She was a fallen comrade, a piece of their shared history they'd thought lost forever. "Well," Bobby said finally, breaking the silence, "I guess that settles it. We're definitely in now." Frank looked at each man in turn, receiving firm nods of agreement. With a decisive motion, he picked up the retirement paperwork from the table and tore it in half. "I'll call Collins. Tell him we accept the mission." As his friends continued their breakfast, Frank stepped inside to make the call. Through the window, he could see the 3 men laughing and joking on the porch, momentarily shedding the weight of age and past injuries as they reminisced about their shared experiences. This was what the autonomous tanks could never replace, he thought. Not the precision targeting or the tactical execution, but this, the brotherhood formed in the crucible of combat, the bonds that transcended rank and time and circumstance. If he could impart even a fraction of that understanding to this final class, then perhaps the legacy of the American Tank Corps would live on, even after the last Abrams was relegated to a museum pedestal. General Collins answered on the second ring. "I take it you've made your decision?" Frank watched his old crew through the window. "We're in, all of us. When do we start?" "Transport to Fort Irwin is arranged for tomorrow morning. The advance team is already there, preparing the tanks and training facilities." "Has Reed been informed that we're joining the cadre?" Collins hesitated. "He's been told that special advisors are being assigned. I left the details for you to explain in person. Not ideal, but manageable." "Understood, we'll be ready." "Frank," Collins said, his tone turning serious, "I want you to know how much this means. Not just to me, but to everyone who ever served in a tank. What you and your team do in these next few weeks will determine how future generations remember the tank corps, whether they understand what made it special or whether it's just another obsolete weapon system consigned to the history books. The weight of that responsibility settled on Frank's shoulders. "We won't let you down, sir." "I know you won't. Good hunting, Colonel." Frank ended the call and rejoined his friends on the porch. They looked at him expectantly. "It's official. We leave for Fort Irwin tomorrow morning. Special advisors to the 67th Armored Regiment for its final training rotation." Jake raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To the Tigers. One last mission." The others joined in, their cups meeting with a gentle clink. "To the Tigers," they echoed. "One last mission." As the sun rose higher over the Georgia pines, Frank felt a strange mixture of emotions. Nostalgia for the past, apprehension about the future, but most of all, gratitude for the opportunity to write the final chapter of a story he'd been part of for 40 years. Whatever happened at Fort Irwin, he and his crew would ensure that the legacy of the American Tank Corps endured. Not in the cold precision of autonomous machines, but in the hearts and minds of those who understood that true combat effectiveness came not just from technology, but from the indomitable human spirit that gave it purpose and meaning. The Mojave Desert stretched out before them as their transport helicopter approached Fort Irwin. From the air, the National Training Center resembled an alien landscape, vast expanses of sand and rock, dotted with the occasional oasis of military infrastructure. Purpose-built mock villages and urban training complexes broke the monotony, designed to simulate the environments where modern armored warfare was most likely to occur. Frank gazed out the window, memories washing over him. He'd trained here countless times throughout his career, had commanded tanks through these valleys and over these ridges in exercises designed to prepare soldiers for combat in the Middle East. The terrain might look nothing like Georgia or Germany or Korea, but to American tankers, the Mojave was as familiar as their own backyards. "Doesn't change, does it?" Jake said from beside him, voice raised over the thrum of the rotors. Frank shook his head. Sand and sun, the tanker's natural habitat. The helicopter banked, bringing the main base into view. A sprawling complex of administrative buildings, barracks, maintenance facilities, and training centers. Fort Irwin was a small city unto itself, home to thousands of soldiers and civilian personnel. And there, on the vast motor pool tarmac, sat their objective, a row of M1 Abrams tanks, their desert tan paint schemes blending with the surrounding landscape. Even from this distance, they were an impressive sight. 65 tons of American engineering, the most lethal land warfare system ever devised, and soon to be obsolete if the proponents of autonomous warfare had their way. The helicopter touched down on the landing pad near the base headquarters. As the rotors slowed, a small welcoming committee approached. At its head was a tall, lean officer in his mid-40s, his desert combat uniform impeccably pressed despite the heat and dust. "Lieutenant Colonel Reed," Frank identified him for the others. "Hasn't changed much since he was a captain." They disembarked, duffel bags slung over shoulders, and approached the waiting officers. Reed stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Colonel Harrington," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Fort Irwin. I was surprised to hear you'd be joining us for this rotation." Frank accepted the handshake. "Good to see you again, Mark. It's been what, 10 years? 12. That conference at the War College on the future of armored warfare." Reed's lips quirked in a faint smile. "We were on opposite panels, as I recall. You argued for remote-operated tanks. I argued for keeping the human crew in the vehicle. And now we're both being rendered obsolete by full autonomy." Reed gestured to the others. "Sergeant Major Martinez, First Sergeant Wilson, Master Sergeant Thompson. Welcome. I didn't realize you were the special advisors General Collins mentioned." Sam leaned on his cane, his artificial leg less comfortable after the long flight. The general thought this final class deserved instructors with experience, real experience. If Reed took offense at the implied criticism, he didn't show it. "Of course, your expertise will be valuable. The students arrive tomorrow. Today is for you to get situated and familiarize yourselves with the training schedule." He introduced the other officers, Major Sarah Chen, his executive officer, Captain James Rodriguez, the operations officer, and Lieutenant Jennifer Park, the intelligence officer. All were young, likely born after Frank and his crew had already earned their tank commander qualifications. "We've arranged quarters for you in the senior NCO barracks," Reed continued. "After you've settled in, I'd like to brief you on the training plan, say 1,400 hours in the Tactical Operations Center." Frank nodded. "We'll be there." Reed and his staff departed, leaving Frank and his crew to gather their gear and follow a junior officer to their assigned quarters. As they walked, Bobby voiced what they were all thinking. Well, that was frosty. Your former student doesn't seem thrilled to have you here. Reed's a professional, Frank replied. He'll work with us, even if he doesn't agree with our presence. Their quarters were Spartan but comfortable. 4 small private rooms sharing a common area. Military efficiency at its finest. They stowed their gear and changed into desert combat uniforms, preparing for the meeting ahead. At precisely 1400 hours, they entered the Tactical Operations Center. Reed and his staff were waiting, along with several civilian technicians wearing corporate logos on their polo shirts. Large displays showed satellite imagery of the training area, along with status reports on the tanks and other equipment. Gentlemen, Reed began as they took their seats, let me explain the purpose and scope of this final training rotation. He activated a presentation on the main screen. Operation Legacy, as it's officially designated, is a 6-week course designed to qualify 12 officers and NCOs on the M1A2 SCPV-3 Abrams. Unlike standard tank commander courses, this rotation has dual purposes: to ensure these individuals are fully qualified on the platform, and to document the history and traditions of American tank warfare for the historical record. The screen showed images of the 12 tanks assigned to the rotation, each with its own designation and combat history. These 12 vehicles represent the last operational M1A2 SCPV-3s in Army inventory. Each has seen combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria. Each has a story to tell. Part of your role as special advisors will be to help capture those stories, to ensure that the legacy of these machines and the men who crewed them is preserved. Frank studied the images. There was Tiger 01, their old tank, restored to operational condition. The sight of it stirred emotions he hadn't expected: pride, nostalgia, and a strange sense of completion, as if his career had come full circle. The training schedule is divided into 3 phases, Reed continued. Phase 1, basic qualification, ensuring all students master the fundamental skills of tank operation and command. Phase 2, tactical operations, with emphasis on combined arms warfare in complex environments. Phase 3, the culminating exercise, a 5-day force-on-force scenario against the opposing force regiment. It was a standard training progression, nothing unusual. But what came next surprised Frank. Throughout all phases, we'll be conducting parallel operations with the Autonomous Combat Vehicle Platoon. Reed gestured to one of the civilians who stepped forward. This is Dr. Eleanor Chen, lead engineer from Defense Advanced Systems. She'll be overseeing the ACV component of the exercise. The woman nodded politely. We've deployed 4 prototype M1X autonomous combat vehicles for this rotation. They'll be operating in the same training space as your conventional tanks, providing both support and opposition forces depending on the scenario. This will allow us to gather valuable comparative data while also giving your students exposure to the systems they'll be working alongside in future assignments. Frank exchanged glances with his crew. This hadn't been mentioned by Collins. The presence of the autonomous prototypes changed the dynamics significantly. Will the students have any control over the autonomous vehicles? Jake asked. Dr. Chen shook her head. The M1Xs operate independently based on mission parameters. Human operators can issue high-level commands, objectives, rules of engagement, etc. But tactical decisions are made by the onboard AI. That's what makes them true autonomous systems, not merely remote-controlled platforms. And if the AI makes the wrong decision, Sam pressed, if it mistakes civilians for combatants, or fails to distinguish between a surrender and a feint. The AI has been trained on millions of combat scenarios, Dr. Chen replied, her tone growing defensive. Its decision-making accuracy exceeds human performance by a significant margin. In simulations, Bobby pointed out, not in the fog of war, not when the enemy is actively trying to deceive you or exploit your weaknesses. Reed intervened before the discussion could escalate. These are valid concerns and precisely why we're conducting this parallel training. The future of armored warfare will involve humans and autonomous systems working together. Our students need to understand both the capabilities and limitations of each. He turned to Frank. Colonel Harrington, I understand your expertise is being brought in to ensure our students appreciate the human element of tank warfare, the intangibles that can't be quantified in simulation data or technical specifications. I respect that, but I also ask that you respect what we're trying to accomplish here. a bridge between the traditions of the past and the technologies of the future. It was diplomatically phrased, but the message was clear. Don't undermine the autonomous vehicle program. Frank nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Of course, Lieutenant Colonel. We're here to support the mission, whatever form it takes. Reed seemed satisfied with that answer. Good, now let's discuss the student cohort. The screen changed to show personnel files. 12 faces, a mix of ages, ranks, and backgrounds. Frank recognized Nathan Reed immediately. The resemblance to his father was striking, though the younger Reed appeared more intense, less composed. As you can see, this is not a standard tank commander class. We have 4 combat wounded soldiers completing their rehabilitation before medical retirement, 4 experienced NCOs being retrained for staff positions after the transition to autonomous vehicles, and 4 junior officers at various stages of their careers. Reed highlighted several names. Staff Sergeant Chen, wounded in Syria, lost his right arm below the elbow, now fitted with an advanced prosthetic. Sergeant First Class Washington, traumatic brain injury from an IED in Afghanistan, fully recovered but transitioning to non-combat roles. Lieutenant Ramirez, spinal injury from a helicopter crash, limited mobility, but cleared for tank operations with accommodations. Frank studied the files, noting the remarkable diversity of the group. Men and women from various backgrounds, some with extensive combat experience, others relatively new to the service, all united by their assignment to this final tank commander class. And Second Lieutenant Reed, Frank observed, looking directly at Mark, your son, I believe? A flicker of something, pride, concern, crossed Reed's face. Yes, recently commissioned through Officer Candidate School. This is his first assignment. Interesting choice for a final tank commander course, given the Army's direction. Reed's expression hardened slightly. Nathan requested the assignment specifically. He wanted to understand the platform before it's phased out, to have context for the systems that will replace it. I supported his decision, even though I don't necessarily agree with his reasoning. An interesting dynamic, Frank thought. The father advocating for autonomous systems while the son sought to experience the traditional platform. Perhaps there was an opportunity there. The briefing continued with logistics, scheduling, and administrative details. By the time it concluded, the sun was already lowering toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Any questions before we adjourn? Reed asked. When can we see the tanks? Sam asked, particularly Tiger 01. Reed checked his watch. The motor pool's still open. I can have someone escort you there now, if you wish. Minutes later, they stood on the vast concrete apron where the 12 Abrams tanks were parked in neat rows. Despite decades of technological advancement, the silhouette of the M1 remained instantly recognizable. The angular turret, the long gun barrel, the sloped frontal armor designed to deflect enemy rounds. And there she was, Tiger 01, her hull number freshly painted, her desert tan paint scheme immaculate. Frank approached slowly, almost reverently. This machine had been their home, their office, their sanctuary. Inside its armored shell, they had fought and bled and nearly died. He placed a hand on the composite armor, feeling the residual warmth from the day's sun. Hello, old friend, he murmured. It's been a while. The others joined him, each touching the tank in their own way. Sam, who had lost his leg while serving as its loader, rested his hand on the commander's hatch. Jake ran his fingers along the gun barrel as if checking its alignment by touch. Bobby examined the tracks and suspension, always the mechanically minded one. She looks good, Jake said, better than we left her. Complete rebuild, said the maintenance sergeant who had escorted them. But they kept her history. There's a plaque inside the commander's station listing every crew that ever served on her, every engagement she participated in. Mind if we look inside? Frank asked. The sergeant gestured toward the access ladder. She's all yours, Colonel. Take as long as you need. Frank climbed the familiar path, muscle memory taking over despite the years since he'd last mounted a tank. The commander's hatch opened with a smooth motion, revealing the interior. He dropped down into the seat, inhaling deeply. The scent of metal and oil and electronics was unchanged, a perfume more evocative than any cologne could ever be. The others followed, each taking their old positions. Bobby in the driver's compartment, Jake at the gunner's station, Sam in the loader's position. For a moment, they sat in silence, reconnecting with the machine that had been such a vital part of their lives. Frank ran his hands over the controls, noting the upgrades and modifications that had been made since their time. New targeting systems, improved communications equipment, enhanced survivability features. But the fundamentals remained the same. Four men working in perfect coordination to operate one of the most complex weapons systems ever devised. "How long has it been?" Sam asked. "Since we were all in a tank together?" 15 years, Bobby replied. "Not since the incident." The incident. Their shorthand for the IED attack that had nearly killed them all, that had taken Sam's leg and ended their time as an active crew. None of them liked to discuss it directly, but its presence was always there, an invisible fifth passenger in their reunion. "She still feels right," Jake said, peering through the gunner's sight, "like putting on an old pair of boots that fits perfectly." Frank activated the commander's display, surprised to find the systems powered up and operational. The screen illuminated with status reports, navigational data, and tactical information. Everything was green, all systems nominal. Tiger 01 was ready for action, despite her age and history. A shadow fell across the open hatch. Frank looked up to see Lieutenant Colonel Reed standing on the tarmac, watching them. "How does she feel?" Reed called up. "Everything in order?" Frank nodded. "She's perfect. Whoever restored her did exceptional work." That would be Master Sergeant Rodriguez and his team. They spent 6 months on these 12 tanks, making sure every system was operational, every component up to factory specifications. If we're sending them to museums after this, we wanted them to represent the platform at its best. The others emerged from their stations, gathering around Frank at the commander's position. Reed studied them with an unreadable expression. "I have to admit," he said finally, "seeing the four of you back together, in your old tank, it's quite a sight, like a living museum exhibit." The comment could have been taken as an insult, but Frank detected no malice in Reed's tone. If anything, there was a note of genuine respect, perhaps even nostalgia. "We prefer to think of it as a reunion," Frank replied. "Old comrades getting together for one last mission." Reed nodded. "I understand that sentiment better than you might think, Colonel. Despite our disagreements about the future of armored warfare, I respect what tanks and tank crews have accomplished throughout our military history. That's why I agreed to command this final rotation, to ensure it's done properly." He gestured toward the row of tanks. "These machines changed the nature of warfare. They shaped the outcome of conflicts from World War II to the War on Terror. They deserve to be honored, even as we move beyond them." Frank studied his former student, reassessing his initial impression. Perhaps Reed wasn't entirely the technocrat Collins had described. There seemed to be genuine sentiment beneath the professional exterior. "The students arrive at 0800 tomorrow," Reed continued. "I'd like you and your team to join us for the welcoming brief. After that, you'll have the afternoon to begin your portion of the instruction. The tanks will be ready for hands-on training by day 3. "We'll be ready," Frank assured him. Reed turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Colonel. My son Nathan, he requested this assignment specifically because of you." That was unexpected. "Me? I've never met him." "No, but he's heard the stories. The Battle of 73 Easting, the Thunder Run into Baghdad, the defense of Fallujah. You're something of a legend to young officers studying armored warfare." Reed's expression turned serious. "He may seek you out, ask you questions that go beyond the technical aspects of tank command. I won't interfere with that, but I would appreciate it if you'd remember that he's still finding his way as an officer. His views aren't fully formed yet." The implication was clear. "Don't turn my son against the autonomous vehicle program." Frank nodded, making no promises. "I'll treat him like any other student, with respect and honesty." That seemed to satisfy Reed. He departed, leaving Frank and his crew alone with their tank as the desert twilight deepened toward night. "Well," Jake said once Reed was out of earshot, "that was interesting. The son wants to meet the legend. The father is worried about what the legend might say." "Family dynamics aside," Sam observed, "it sounds like we've got a receptive audience. At least some of these students want more than just technical instruction. They want the stories, the traditions, the intangibles." Frank gazed across the motor pool at the 11 other tanks, each with its own history, its own legacy. Somewhere in the shadows beyond them, he knew, sat the 4 autonomous prototypes, sleeker, more advanced, uninhabited. The future of armored warfare, if Reed and his civilian partners were to be believed. But not yet. Not while these 12 steel beasts still rolled across the desert sand. not while men and women still trained to command them. For 6 more weeks, the human element would remain central to American tank warfare. 6 weeks to ensure that even after the last Abrams was consigned to a museum pedestal, its spirit, the courage, the camaraderie, the code of honor that had defined tank crews for generations, would live on. "We start at 0800, Frank said, closing the commander's hatch with a decisive motion. "Let's make every day count." The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as the 12 students assembled in formation. Frank Harrington studied them from the sidelines, taking the measure of the men and women who would form the final class of M1 Abrams tank commanders in United States Army history. They stood at attention in desert combat uniforms, duffel bags at their feet, expressions betraying various combinations of anticipation, nervousness, and in some cases, physical discomfort from their injuries. Lieutenant Colonel Reed addressed them with practiced precision, outlining the purpose and structure of the 6-week course. His voice carried across the parade ground, crisp and authoritative. "You 12 have been selected for a unique mission," Reed announced. "To qualify as the final class of M1A2 Abrams tank commanders before the platform is retired from active service. This is both an honor and a responsibility. You will be the last link in a chain that stretches back the first M1 crews in 1980, and through them, to the tank commanders of every American conflict since World War I. Frank watched the students' reactions. Some straightened with pride. Others remained impassive, professional masks in place. The wounded warriors, recognizable by their prosthetics or subtle accommodations in their uniforms, seemed the most affected, perhaps understanding better than most the significance of this final class. "Your instructors for this course represent the finest tankers in Army history," Reed continued, gesturing toward Frank and his crew. "Colonel Frank Harrington and his team from the legendary 67th Armored Regiment will serve as special advisors throughout your training. Their experience spans 4 decades and multiple conflicts. I expect you to take full advantage of their expertise while it's available to you." The student's eyes shifted to Frank and his team, many with expressions of recognition or respect. Frank maintained a neutral expression, but inwardly he noted the impact of Reed's introduction. Despite their philosophical differences regarding the future of armored warfare, Reed had given them a proper acknowledgement. "One final note," Reed said, his tone shifting subtly. "This training rotation includes a parallel component involving the next generation of armored combat systems. 4 M1X autonomous combat vehicles will be operating in the training area, conducting their own exercises and occasionally integrating with yours. This represents a unique opportunity to witness the transition from manned to autonomous platforms in real time. I encourage you to observe their capabilities whenever possible." A murmur ran through the formation. Frank caught several students exchanging glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to concern. One face in particular stood out, a young lieutenant whose features strongly resembled Reed's. Nathan Reed, the commander's son, was watching his father with an intensity that suggested more than mere professional interest. After the formation was dismissed, the students were assigned to barracks and given time to settle in before afternoon orientation. Frank and his crew retreated to the instructor's lounge in the training center, reviewing the day's schedule and discussing their approach. "First impressions?" Frank asked, pouring coffee for the team. Jake leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Mixed bag. Some of them look like solid material. A few seem like they're just checking a box before transitioning to other roles." "The wounded warriors are the ones to watch," Sam said. "They've got something to prove, and they understand what's at stake, especially Chen and Washington." Bobby nodded in agreement. "Did you see their faces when Reed mentioned the autonomous vehicles? Like they'd been told their replacement was in the room." "That's exactly what they were told," Frank pointed out. "Reed's not being subtle about the direction things are moving." Their discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Frank called for the visitor to enter and was surprised to see Lieutenant Nathan Reed step into the room. The young officer approached with a confident stride despite the uncertainty in his expression. "Colonel Harrington, sir," Lieutenant Nathan Reed. "I was hoping I might have a word with you before orientation." Frank gestured to a chair. "Have a seat, Lieutenant. Coffee?" "No, thank you, sir." Reed remained standing, his posture formal. "I wanted to speak with you privately, but I see your team is here. Perhaps another time would be better." Jake stood up. "We were just leaving to inspect the training tanks, weren't we, gentlemen?" Sam and Bobby took the cue, making their excuses and filing out of the room. Frank hid a smile at their transparent maneuver, then turned his attention to the young officer. "Sit, Lieutenant. What's on your mind?" Nathan Reed finally relaxed enough to take a seat, though his posture remained military straight. Up close, the resemblance to his father was even more pronounced, but there were differences. The younger Reed's eyes held an earnestness that the senior Reeds had long since lost, replaced by the calculated assessment of a career officer. "Sir, I want to make it clear that my assignment to this course wasn't due to my father's influence. I requested it specifically against his recommendation." Frank raised an eyebrow. "I hadn't assumed otherwise, but I'm curious why you choose to qualify on a platform that's being phased out. Most lieutenants want to be on the cutting edge, not learning obsolete systems." Reed hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "With respect, sir, I don't believe the Abrams is obsolete. Different from what's coming, yes. But there are lessons in its operation, in its very design, that I think are essential to understand before we transition fully to autonomous systems." "Interesting. And your father disagrees?" "He believes I'm being sentimental, that I should focus on the future, not the past." Reed leaned forward slightly. "But that's why I wanted to speak with you, sir. You were his mentor once. You taught him tank warfare when he was a lieutenant. I've read your papers on the human element in armored combat. They're still taught at West Point." Frank studied the young man with growing interest. "What exactly are you hoping to learn from me, Lieutenant? Tank operation, battle tactics, or something else?" "All of it, sir, but especially," Reed seemed to struggle for the right words, "how to be a tank commander. Not just the technical aspects, but what it means. What makes a great tank commander different from a merely competent one?" The earnestness in the young man's voice stirred something in Frank. Here was a student who truly wanted to learn, not just check boxes on a qualification form. And the fact that it was Mark Reed's son added a layer of complexity that was both challenging and intriguing. "Your father is one of the finest tank officers I ever trained," Frank said finally. "Whatever our current disagreements about the future of armored warfare, he was exceptional in the field. His understanding of tactics, his ability to read the battlefield, his care for his crew, all top tier." "I know, sir. I've heard the stories. That's why his current position seems so—" Reed trailed off, unwilling to criticize his father directly. "Contradictory," Frank supplied. "People change, Lieutenant. Perspectives shift. That doesn't invalidate either his past accomplishments or his current convictions." Reed nodded, accepting the diplomatic response. "Yes, sir. In any case, I want you to know that I'm approaching this course with complete commitment. Whatever you and your team have to teach, I'm ready to learn." Frank regarded the young officer thoughtfully. "I believe you are. And I'll make you a promise, Lieutenant. By the end of this rotation, you'll understand what it truly means to be a tank commander. Not just the mechanics and the tactics, but the heart of it. The part no autonomous system can replicate." "Thank you, sir." Reed stood, his mission apparently accomplished. "I should get ready for orientation." "One more thing, Lieutenant." Frank fixed him with a direct look. "This conversation stays between us. I won't have the other students thinking you're receiving special attention." "Understood, sir, absolutely." After Reed departed, Frank sat alone with his thoughts. The encounter had been unexpected but illuminating. Nathan Reed wasn't just going through the motions. He genuinely wanted to understand tank warfare from a perspective his father no longer valued. That presented both an opportunity and a challenge. How to reach not just Nathan Reed but all 12 students. How to convey in 6 short weeks the essence of what made tank crews special. What distinguished them from the cold precision of autonomous machines. The afternoon orientation passed in a blur of administrative details, safety briefings, and course overviews. Frank and his team were introduced more formally, each describing their backgrounds and expertise. The students listened attentively, particularly when Sam spoke about his experiences as a wounded warrior who had continued to serve. "The tank saved my life," Sam told them, gesturing to his prosthetic leg. "The IED that took this would have taken all of me if I hadn't been inside 65 tons of American engineering. But it wasn't just the tank as a machine, it was the crew. My brothers in that steel box who dragged me out under fire, who applied the tourniquets, who called in the medevac while continuing to fight. That's what we're here to teach you, not just how to operate a weapon system, but how to be part of something greater than yourself." The wounded warriors in the class seemed particularly moved by Sam's words. Staff Sergeant Chen, with his advanced prosthetic arm, nodded in solemn understanding. Sergeant First Class Washington, still dealing with the after effects of traumatic brain injury, leaned forward as if drinking in every word. As the orientation concluded, Lieutenant Colonel Reed approached Frank with a tablet displaying the next day's schedule. "We'll begin with classroom instruction on Abrams systems and capabilities," Reed explained. "Your team will take the afternoon session on crew coordination and commander responsibilities. The tanks will be ready for hands-on training the following day." Frank reviewed the schedule, noting the compressed time frame. "This is ambitious. 6 weeks to qualify tank commanders normally takes 10. "We have excellent students and exceptional instructors," Reed replied smoothly. "I'm confident we can meet the timeline." Frank wasn't convinced, but he kept his concerns to himself. "And the autonomous vehicles? When will they be integrated into the training?" "They begin their own exercises tomorrow. Initial integration with the student tanks is scheduled for the end of week 2 after basic qualifications are complete." Reed hesitated, then added, "Dr. Chen has requested that you and your team observe the M1X operations when your schedule permits. She believes your perspective would be valuable, even if critical." An olive branch or a challenge? Frank couldn't be sure, but he nodded in agreement. "We'll make time. I'm curious to see these autonomous tanks in action." The first week of training passed in a grueling rhythm of classroom instruction, physical conditioning, and the first tentative hands-on experiences with the tanks. Frank and his team divided their efforts, each taking responsibility for different aspects of the curriculum. Jake focused on gunnery and target acquisition, Sam on loading procedures and ammunition handling, Bobby on driving and maintenance. Frank oversaw it all, with special emphasis on tactical decision-making and crew leadership. The students proved capable, if uneven in their preparation. Some, like Staff Sergeant Chen and Lieutenant Ramirez, had previous armored vehicle experience and adapted quickly to the Abrams systems. Others, including 2 of the wounded warriors, struggled with the physical demands despite their determination. Nathan Reed fell somewhere in the middle, technically proficient but sometimes hesitant in making tactical decisions. Frank watched him closely, noting both his strengths and weaknesses. The young lieutenant absorbed information like a sponge, but seemed to overthink situations that required immediate action. On the 5th day, Frank observed the autonomous tanks for the first time. From a safe distance atop a ridge overlooking the training area, he watched as 4 M1X vehicles executed a complex maneuver without a single human on board. The sleek machines moved with uncanny precision, maintaining perfect formation as they navigated obstacles and engaged simulated targets. Dr. Chen stood beside him, monitoring the exercise on a tablet that displayed real-time data from the vehicle's systems. "Impressive, isn't it?" she said, not bothering to hide her pride. 4 vehicles operating in perfect coordination, sharing tactical data instantaneously, executing maneuvers that would take human crews weeks to master. Frank had to admit the technical achievement was remarkable. The autonomous tanks moved with a fluid grace that almost seemed organic, despite being governed entirely by algorithms and sensors. "They're fast," he acknowledged, "and precise. But how do they handle the unexpected? Ambushes? Civilians on the battlefield? Moral dilemmas." Dr. Chen swiped through screens on her tablet. "The AI is trained on millions of scenarios, including ethical decision trees for complex situations. It can process information and make judgments far faster than human operators, without emotional interference." "Emotional interference," Frank repeated. "You mean courage, compassion, moral intuition?" Dr. Chen looked up, her expression softening slightly. "I understand your concerns, Colonel. Truly I do. But consider this. Autonomous systems don't experience fear. They don't hesitate, they don't freeze under pressure, and they don't come home in body bags. They also don't inspire loyalty," Frank countered. "They don't build camaraderie. They don't make the kind of judgment calls that come from lived experience rather than programmed responses." To his surprise, Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Valid points, which is precisely why the future isn't about replacing humans entirely, but about finding the optimal balance between human oversight and autonomous execution." Their discussion was interrupted by Lieutenant Colonel Reed joining them on the ridge. He surveyed the autonomous tanks with evident satisfaction. "Phase 1 tests are exceeding expectations," he reported. "Reaction times 43% faster than human crews, target acquisition 27% more accurate, and no degradation in performance after continuous operation." "And what about adaptive problem solving?" Frank asked. How do they perform when the situation doesn't match any of their program scenarios? Reed exchanged a glance with Dr. Chen before responding. That's what Phase 2 is designed to test. Increasingly complex and unpredictable scenarios, including simulated system malfunctions and contradictory tactical information. Frank watched as the autonomous tanks completed their maneuver, returning to perfect formation with mechanical precision. I'd like to see that, and I'd like my students to see it as well. If these machines are the future, they should understand both their capabilities and their limitations. Reed seemed pleased by the request. I'll arrange it. Perhaps a comparative exercise? Your students in conventional tanks alongside the autonomous units, running the same course. It would be instructive. The way Reed emphasized the last words suggested he anticipated a clear demonstration of the autonomous vehicle's superiority. Frank accepted the implicit challenge with a nod. Very instructive for everyone involved. The comparative exercise was scheduled for the end of the second week, after the students had completed basic qualification on the Abrams. In the days leading up to it, Frank pushed his class harder than ever, focusing not just on technical proficiency, but on the intangibles that distinguish great tank crews from merely adequate ones. Anticipation, he explained during an evening lecture, the ability to predict what your crew needs before they ask for it, to sense when your gunner has the perfect shot, when your driver needs guidance, when your loader is struggling with a heavy round. These aren't things you can measure with sensors or program into an AI. They come from spending hours together in that steel box, learning each other's rhythms, developing a sixth sense for the machine and the men operating it. The students absorbed these lessons with varying degrees of receptiveness. Some clearly valued the human element Frank described. Others seemed more enamored with the technical aspects of tank operation, viewing the psychological dimensions as secondary. Nathan Reed, interestingly, fell into the former category. He approached Frank after the lecture, full of questions about crew dynamics and the mental aspects of command. How do you know when to trust your instincts over the data? He asked. When all the tactical information says one thing, but your gut tells you something else? Experience, Frank replied, and knowing your crew, understanding what they're capable of, what motivates them, how they respond under pressure. That's not something you can quantify or program. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. My father used to talk that way, about the art of command, not just the science. But lately it's all about data and algorithms and empirical performance metrics. Frank chose his next words carefully. Your father is adapting to a changing environment. That's what good officers do. But adaptation doesn't mean abandoning everything that came before. The best innovations build on tradition. They don't erase it. The day of the comparative exercise dawned clear and cold, the Mojave Desert's extreme temperature variations on full display. Frank gathered his 12 students around a tactical map, outlining the challenge ahead. Today you'll be running Course Bravo in your tanks, executing a standard attack maneuver against simulated enemy positions. The autonomous vehicles will run the same course immediately afterward. This isn't a competition, he emphasized, though everyone knew it was exactly that. It's an opportunity to observe different approaches to the same tactical problem. The students were divided into 3 tank platoons of 4 vehicles each. Frank assigned Nathan Reed to command the 3rd platoon, wanting to see how the lieutenant handled the responsibility. Each platoon would attack a different sector of the course, navigating obstacles and engaging targets along the way. As the exercise began, Frank monitored the action from the command center alongside Lieutenant Colonel Reed and Dr. Chen. Large displays showed the position of each tank, while smaller screens provided views from cameras mounted throughout the course and on the vehicles themselves. The first 2 platoons performed admirably, executing textbook maneuvers with only minor hesitations. They engaged and destroyed their targets efficiently, though not with the mechanical precision the autonomous vehicles would likely display. Then came Nathan Reed's platoon, attacking the most challenging sector with complex terrain and multiple target arrays. At first, they followed the standard approach, advancing in formation while maintaining appropriate intervals. But as they encountered the first target cluster, Nathan made an unexpected decision. Instead of engaging from prepared positions as doctrine dictated, he ordered his platoon to execute a flanking maneuver through a narrow ravine, emerging behind the simulated enemy force. It was a high-risk move. The ravine could have concealed hostile forces, and the maneuver exposed the tank's more vulnerable rear armor during the turn. Frank leaned forward, watching intently. Beside him, Lieutenant Colonel Reed's expression tightened with concern. That's not the approved tactical solution, Reed observed. It's unnecessarily risky. It's creative, Frank countered, and potentially more effective if it works. And work it did. Nathan's platoon emerged from the ravine in perfect position to engage the enemy from an unexpected angle. They destroyed all targets within seconds, completing their sector clearance faster than either of the previous platoons. As Nathan's tanks regrouped for the next phase, Frank glanced at Reed, noting the conflicted expression on the lieutenant colonel's face. Pride in his son's performance warred with concern over the deviation from established doctrine. He has good instincts, Frank commented. Knows when to follow the book and when to improvise. Reed nodded reluctantly. Yes, but improvisation introduces variables, unpredictability. Also known as initiative and adaptability, Frank pointed out, qualities that have won battles throughout history. The exercise continued, with all three platoons completing the course successfully despite various challenges and obstacles. When the last tank returned to the assembly area, Frank gathered the students for a debrief, reviewing their performance and highlighting areas for improvement. Overall, solid execution, he concluded. Platoon 3, your flanking maneuver was unorthodox but effective. Good use of terrain and tactical surprise. That kind of adaptability is what distinguishes exceptional tank commanders from merely competent ones. Nathan Reed accepted the praise with professional modesty, though Frank could see the satisfaction in the young lieutenant's eyes. The other students regarded him with newfound respect, recognizing the boldness of his tactical decision. Then it was the autonomous vehicle's turn. The four M1X tanks moved onto the course with synchronized precision, their turrets swiveling in perfect unison as they scanned for targets. What followed was a display of mechanical efficiency that was both impressive and somehow unsettling. The autonomous tanks completed the course in record time, engaging and destroying every target with flawless accuracy. They never hesitated, never deviated from their optimized route, never missed a shot. It was a technical masterpiece, a demonstration of everything machines could do better than humans. When the autonomous vehicles completed their run, the data was unmistakable. They had outperformed the human-crewed tanks by every quantifiable metric: time to completion, ammunition expenditure, target acquisition speed, hit percentage. In the command center, Dr. Chen presented the results with professional restraint, though her satisfaction was evident. As you can see, the autonomous systems demonstrated superior performance across all measured parameters. Particularly notable is the consistency between vehicles, with virtually identical execution despite varying terrain and target distributions. Lieutenant Colonel Reed nodded in approval. An exceptional demonstration of the technology's capabilities. This is why the future of armored warfare is autonomous, gentlemen. The data speaks for itself. Frank studied the comparative metrics displayed on the main screen. The numbers were indeed impressive, a clear victory for the machines by any objective measure. Yet something felt missing from the analysis. The autonomous vehicles followed the optimal route calculated from complete terrain data and known target positions, he observed. How would they perform without that advanced knowledge, in conditions where the map doesn't match the territory? Dr. Chen's expression cooled slightly. The AI is capable of real-time adaptation based on sensor input. If conditions differ from expected parameters, it recalculates optimal solutions instantaneously. Within programmed boundaries, Frank pressed. But what about truly unexpected situations? Morally ambiguous scenarios, conditions that require intuition rather than calculation? That's what the Phase 2 testing will explore, Reed interjected, his tone suggesting this line of questioning had gone far enough. For now, let's focus on today's results and what they mean for our training objectives. The debriefing concluded with Reed emphasizing the importance of precision and consistency in tank operations, implicitly reinforcing the message that the autonomous systems represented the superior approach. As the students were dismissed, Frank noted their subdued expressions. The comparison had been demoralizing, making their human efforts seem clumsy and inefficient compared to the machine's flawless execution. Later that evening, Frank found Bobby examining one of the tanks in the motor pool, checking the track tension with the careful attention of a lifelong mechanic. They're talking about the exercise, Bobby reported without preamble. The students, some are questioning the point of learning to operate tanks when the autonomous versions are so much better. Frank leaned against the hull, considering this unwelcome development. They're missing the point. It's not about who's faster or more accurate in a controlled exercise. It's about who you want making life or death decisions when everything goes wrong. Bobby straightened up from his inspection. Maybe that's the problem, Frank. We haven't shown them what happens when everything goes wrong. They've only seen the machines performing in optimal conditions. The observation struck a chord. The students needed to see more than technical proficiency. They needed to understand the limitations of autonomous systems, the value of human judgment in crisis situations. You're right, Frank acknowledged. We need to change our approach. Stop trying to match the machines at their game and start showing what humans do better. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The next morning, Lieutenant Colonel Reed announced a change to the training schedule. We're accelerating the integration phase, he informed Frank and his team. Starting tomorrow, your students will conduct joint operations with the autonomous vehicles. Each student tank commander will be responsible for coordinating with an M1X during tactical exercises. Frank recognized the adjustment for what it was, an effort to acclimate the students to working with and eventually being replaced by the autonomous systems. Reed was subtly shifting the emphasis from tank commander to autonomous system supervisor. What kind of exercises? Frank asked. Urban operations initially, Reed replied. Clearing a simulated town with mixed conventional and autonomous forces. It's the most challenging environment for both human crews and AI systems, requiring close coordination and rapid decision-making. The urban warfare scenario presented both a challenge and an opportunity. Frank gathered his team to develop a new approach to the training. We need to create situations the autonomous systems can't handle optimally, he explained. Scenarios where human judgment and experience make the critical difference. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Ambiguous targets, civilian presence, moral dilemmas. Exactly, the machines excel at clear-cut tactical problems. We need to introduce complexity and uncertainty. They spent hours planning, identifying potential weaknesses in the autonomous system's decision-making algorithms, and developing scenarios that would highlight them. By morning, they had a new strategy for the urban warfare exercise, one that would demonstrate the continuing value of human tank commanders. The simulated town was a sprawling complex of concrete buildings, rubble-strewn streets, and narrow alleyways. Designed to replicate the conditions of urban combat in the Middle East, it provided a challenging environment for armored operations. Visibility was limited, maneuver space was restricted, and potential ambush points were numerous. Frank briefed his students before they entered their tanks, emphasizing the unique challenges of urban warfare. In the city, the usual advantages of armor are constrained, he explained. You can't see as far, you can't move as freely. Threats can come from any direction, including above. This is where tank commanders earn their pay, making split-second decisions with incomplete information in a highly complex environment. He assigned each student tank to work with a specific autonomous vehicle, creating mixed platoons that would have to coordinate their movements and actions. Nathan Reed's tank was paired with M1X01, the lead autonomous vehicle. Remember, Frank concluded, your job isn't just to complete the mission, it's to protect your crew, civilian non-combatants, and yes, even your autonomous partner. Sometimes that means making decisions that aren't tactically optimal, but are morally necessary. The exercise began with the mixed force entering the town from multiple directions, tasked with clearing hostile forces while minimizing collateral damage. Unknown to the students, Frank and his team had arranged for several unexpected elements to be introduced during the operation, situations designed to test the limits of the autonomous system's decision-making. From the command center, Frank watched the operation unfold. The tanks moved cautiously through the narrow streets, turrets swiveling as they scanned for threats. The autonomous vehicles led the way, their sensors providing a constant stream of data to their human counterparts. The first test came at an intersection near the center of town. As Nathan Reed's tank and its autonomous partner approached, a group of role players emerged from a building, their status deliberately ambiguous. Some carried objects that could be interpreted as weapons, but were actually tools. Others made gestures that could be seen as threatening or merely emphatic communication. The autonomous tank's targeting system immediately designated the group as hostile, its turrets swinging to track them. Inside the command center, alarms sounded as the M1X prepared to engage. Potential civilian casualties, a technician announced. M1X01 has classified the group as combatants based on carried objects and behavioral patterns. Dr. Chen moved quickly to the console. Override Protocol Alpha. Stand down M1X01. Before she could input the command, Nathan Reed's voice came over the communications channel. This is Saber 3. Those are civilians with construction tools. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. His tank moved forward, interposing itself between the autonomous vehicle and the role players. It was a decisive action, placing his own vehicle at risk to prevent a potential tragedy. In the command center, Reed and Dr. Chen exchanged concerned glances. Lieutenant Reed is interfering with M1X01's tactical assessment, Dr. Chen noted, her tone neutral, but her expression tense. He's also preventing a serious mistake, Frank pointed out. Those are clearly civilians. The autonomous system misinterpreted the situation due to superficial similarities to threat patterns in its database. As the exercise continued, similar scenarios unfolded across the simulated town. In each case, the human tank commanders had to make judgment calls that went beyond simple tactical calculations, assessing ambiguous situations through the lens of experience and moral understanding. Some of the autonomous vehicles performed better than others, demonstrating the variability in their decision-making algorithms. But in every complex scenario, the human commanders provided the essential judgment that prevented potential catastrophes. The exercise concluded with a mixed record of success. The town had been cleared of simulated enemy forces, but several autonomous vehicles had made decisions that would have resulted in civilian casualties or friendly fire incidents if not for human intervention. The debriefing that followed was tense. Lieutenant Colonel Reed reviewed the operation with clinical detachment, noting areas of effective coordination between human and autonomous forces while glossing over the problematic decisions made by the M1X tanks. Dr. Chen was more direct in her assessment. We identified several decision-making algorithms that require refinement, particularly regarding civilian combatant discrimination in complex urban environments. The data collected today will be invaluable for improving the next generation of autonomous systems. When it was Frank's turn to speak, he focused on the human element that had made the difference. Today you demonstrated something that no autonomous system can replicate: moral judgment. The ability to see beyond tactical parameters and consider the human cost of your decisions. Lieutenant Reed's action to protect misidentified civilians is a perfect example. He recognized the potential tragedy and took personal risk to prevent it. That kind of judgment can't be programmed. It comes from experience, empathy, and a fundamental understanding of our responsibilities as soldiers and as human beings. The students straightened imperceptibly at his words, a renewed sense of purpose visible in their expressions. They had seen firsthand the limitations of the autonomous systems, had experienced the critical importance of human oversight in complex operations. Lieutenant Colonel Reed's response was measured but pointed. Colonel Harrington makes valid observations about today's exercise. However, I would remind everyone that the autonomous systems we're working with are prototypes. Each iteration incorporates lessons learned, improving decision-making and reducing error rates. The M1X01 that misidentified civilians today will be succeeded by systems with more sophisticated recognition algorithms and better contextual understanding. No doubt, Frank acknowledged. But will they ever develop moral intuition? The ability to weigh tactical advantage against ethical considerations? To make the kind of judgment calls that define us not just as soldiers, but as human beings? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Reed moved on to the next day's schedule, effectively closing the philosophical debate before it could develop further. As the debriefing concluded, Frank noticed Nathan Reed watching him intently. The young lieutenant approached, and as the room cleared, his expression troubled. "Sir, may I speak with you privately?" Frank nodded, leading him to a quiet corner of the command center. "What's on your mind, Lieutenant?" "Today's exercise," Nathan began, "and the decision I made to override M1X01's threat assessment. My father thinks I acted prematurely, that I should have trusted the autonomous system's sensors over my own judgment." "And what do you think?" Nathan's expression was earnest, conflicted. "I know what I saw, sir. Those were civilians with tools, not combatants with weapons. The autonomous system got it wrong. If this had been a real operation, people would have died," Frank finished the thought. "Innocent people. Your decision saved lives, Lieutenant. Trust that judgment." "But the technology will improve," Nathan argued, echoing his father's point. "Better sensors, better algorithms. Eventually, the machines won't make those mistakes." Frank considered this, choosing his response carefully. "Perhaps, but there will always be situations that fall outside their program parameters. Moral ambiguities, ethical dilemmas, moments where the right decision can't be calculated, only felt." Nathan nodded slowly, absorbing the perspective. "Thank you, sir. I needed to hear that." As Nathan departed, Frank was joined by Lieutenant Colonel Reed, who had observed their conversation from a distance. Filling my son's head with doubts about the autonomous program? Reed's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. Encouraging him to trust his judgment, Frank corrected. Something you taught him, I suspect, before you became convinced that algorithms could replace human decision-making. Reed's expression hardened momentarily, then relaxed into something more reflective. I haven't forgotten the value of human judgment, Frank. I've simply recognized its limitations. We make mistakes, we hesitate, we allow emotions to cloud our tactical assessments. The autonomous systems eliminate those variables. And in doing so, eliminate something essential, Frank countered. The moral compass that guides our decisions in the fog of war. The humanity that allows us to see beyond tactical objectives to the people affected by our actions. Reed shook his head, not in disagreement, but in recognition of an unbridgeable philosophical divide. We'll never see eye to eye on this, will we? You'll always believe in the primacy of human judgment. I'll always trust in the potential of technology to overcome human limitations. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, Frank suggested. A partnership rather than a replacement. Human judgment guiding technological capability. Perhaps. Reed checked his watch, signaling an end to the conversation. The autonomous team wants to run diagnostics on the M1X units after today's performance issues. We'll resume joint operations tomorrow, with some adjustments to the scenarios based on what we observed today. After Reed departed, Frank sought out his own team. He found them in the motor pool, where they had gathered with several of the students to examine the tanks after the day's exercise. The mood was surprisingly upbeat, with animated discussions about the urban operations and the performance of both human crews and autonomous vehicles. Word spreading about what happened today, Jake reported quietly as Frank joined them. The autonomous tanks making targeting errors. The human commanders having to intervene. It's changing perceptions. For now, Frank cautioned, Reed's right about one thing, the technology will improve. Each generation of autonomous systems will be better than the last, learning from every mistake. But they'll never be human, Sam insisted. Never understand what it really means to make life or death decisions, to live with the consequences of those decisions. Frank nodded in agreement, watching the students as they inspected their tanks with newfound appreciation. Today had been a small victory in the larger battle for the soul of armored warfare. The students had seen firsthand the limitations of autonomous systems, had experienced the critical importance of human judgment in complex operations. But the war was far from over. The autonomous program had momentum, institutional support, and the backing of powerful defense contractors. What had happened today would be analyzed, the algorithms refined, the weaknesses addressed. The next generation of autonomous tanks would be better, more capable, less prone to the errors that had been exposed. Frank knew they needed something more definitive if they were to make a lasting impression on these students and on the military leadership watching this final tank commander class. Something that would demonstrate beyond doubt the continuing value of human crews in armored warfare. The opportunity presented itself the following week, in a way none of them could have anticipated. The training schedule called for a 3-day field exercise, with the student tanks and autonomous vehicles operating independently in different sectors before coming together for a coordinated assault on the final day. It was the most ambitious scenario yet, designed to test both human commanders and AI systems under realistic combat conditions. The exercise began well, with both groups demonstrating improved performance based on the lessons of previous operations. The student tanks navigated challenging terrain and engaged simulated enemy forces with growing confidence and skill. The autonomous vehicles executed their missions with characteristic precision, though with more conservative target identification protocols after the civilian incident. Frank and his team rotated between the student tanks, observing and advising as the young commanders developed their abilities. Nathan Reed continued to show promise, combining technical proficiency with an increasingly assured tactical judgment. Several of the wounded warriors were performing exceptionally as well, their personal experiences giving them insights that no training program could provide. On the second day, as the exercise intensified, unexpected weather moved into the training area. A rare desert storm brought high winds, driving rain, and severely reduced visibility. Normal protocol would have called for a suspension of operations, but Lieutenant Colonel Reed, after consulting with Dr. Chen, decided to continue. This is an opportunity to test performance under adverse conditions, he explained to Frank. Real combat doesn't pause for bad weather. The autonomous systems need to demonstrate their capabilities in all environments. Frank had reservations but agreed that the experience would be valuable for the students. Adverse conditions often revealed the true character of tank commanders, forcing them to rely on instinct and experience when technology was compromised. As the storm intensified, the autonomous vehicles began to show signs of struggle. Their sensor arrays, normally precise and comprehensive, were degraded by the combination of heavy rain, swirling dust, and electromagnetic interference from the storm. Their movements became more hesitant, their target acquisition less certain. In the command center, Dr. Chen and her team worked frantically to compensate, adjusting parameters and modifying operational protocols in real time. But the autonomous tanks continued to demonstrate erratic behavior, sometimes stopping completely as conflicting sensor data created decision paralysis in their algorithms. We should recall them, Frank suggested as the situation deteriorated. The conditions are beyond their operational parameters. Not yet, Reed insisted. The next generation will need to function in these conditions. The data we're gathering is invaluable. The debate was rendered moot when alarm sirens blared through the command center. One of the technicians monitoring the autonomous vehicles looked up with alarm. M1 is off course and accelerating. It's not responding to override commands. Dr. Chen rushed to the control station, fingers flying over the keyboard as she attempted to regain control. Multiple system failures. The primary guidance system is offline, and the backup is receiving corrupted GPS data. It thinks it's still on course for the objective. Where is it actually headed? Reed demanded. The technician pulled up a map display, directly toward the student tank positions in Sector 7. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Sector 7 was where Nathan Reed's tank was positioned, along with 3 others from his platoon. If the autonomous tank continued on its current trajectory at combat speed, a collision was inevitable. Emergency shutdown, Chen ordered. Initiate remote deactivation protocol. No response. The communications array must be damaged. We've lost remote access. Reed grabbed a radio. All tanks in Sector 7. Be advised, M1 is malfunctioning and headed your way. Evacuate the area immediately. Repeat, evacuate immediately. But the storm was interfering with radio transmissions as well. The acknowledgments came back garbled and incomplete. It wasn't clear if the warning had been received or understood. How long until impact? Frank asked, studying the map. At current speed, 3 minutes, the technician reported. Maybe less, depending on terrain effects. Reed turned to Dr. Chen. Physical fail-safes? There must be some way to shut it down. There's a manual override panel on the rear hull, she confirmed. But someone would have to physically access it while the vehicle is in motion. Frank made a swift calculation. Where's the intercept point? The technician indicated a location on the map. Ridgeline here, approximately 2 kilometers from their current position. Get me there, Frank demanded. Now. Reed started to object, then seemed to recognize the futility of argument. Take my command vehicle. It's the fastest transport we have available. Minutes later, Frank was speeding toward the intercept point in Reed's modified Humvee, fighting for control on the rain-slicked desert terrain. Through the windshield, visibility was reduced to mere meters, the storm transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of swirling dust and water. He reached the ridge just as the autonomous tank crested it from the opposite side, a 65-ton behemoth moving at nearly 40 miles per hour with no human control. Behind it, barely visible through the storm, Frank could make out the shapes of the student tanks, directly in its path and apparently unaware of the danger bearing down on them. Frank positioned the Humvee and leapt out, bracing himself against the wind as he calculated his approach. The autonomous tank would pass within meters of his position. If he timed it perfectly, he might be able to jump onto the rear deck and access the manual override panel. If he misjudged, he would be crushed beneath the treads or thrown aside by the massive vehicle's momentum. As the autonomous tank thundered closer, Frank was struck by the bitter irony of the situation. Here was the future of armored warfare, a technological marvel designed to eliminate the risks of human error, now itself a lethal threat due to sensor failure and algorithmic confusion. No human tank commander would have continued to advance blindly in these conditions, would have recognized the danger and adapted accordingly. The M1 was almost upon him now, its engine roar drowning out even the howling wind. Frank tensed, preparing for the most dangerous maneuver of his 40-year career. 3 seconds to impact. 2, 1. He leapt, fingers grasping for the handholds on the rear deck as his body slammed against the rain-slicked armor. For a terrifying moment, he felt himself sliding off, the tank's momentum threatening to throw him beneath the tracks. Then his fingers found purchase, and he pulled himself onto the deck, fighting for stability as the vehicle continued its headlong charge. The manual override panel was located just behind the turret, protected by a weather-resistant cover. Frank crawled toward it, one hand maintaining his grip on the tank, while the other fought to open the panel against the driving rain and wind. The cover finally yielded, revealing a complex array of switches and indicators. Frank searched for the emergency shutdown, finding it protected by a keyed safety mechanism. He had seconds to disable a system designed specifically to prevent unauthorized deactivation. In the distance, he could now clearly see Nathan Reed's tank directly in the path of the autonomous vehicle. There was no time for finesse or proper procedure. Frank drew his sidearm, aimed carefully despite the tank's violent motion, and fired twice into the control panel. Sparks flew as the bullet shredded delicate electronics. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the autonomous tank began to slow, its drive systems failing as the emergency protocols finally engaged. It ground to a halt less than 100 meters from the student tanks, its turret frozen in mid-rotation. Frank collapsed onto the deck, exhausted and soaked to the skin, but alive. As the adrenaline ebbed, he became aware of voices calling his name. Looking up, he saw Nathan Reed climbing down from his tank, rushing toward him despite the continuing storm. "Colonel, are you all right?" Frank managed a nod as Nathan helped him down from the disabled autonomous vehicle. Other students were approaching now, faces showing a mixture of confusion, concern, and growing comprehension as they realized what had nearly happened. "The autonomous tank malfunctioned," Frank explained, raising his voice over the storm. "Lost guidance control in the weather. It was headed straight for your position at combat speed." Nathan's expression darkened as he understood the implications. The fail-safes didn't work, the remote overrides, all compromised by the storm. Sometimes technology fails when you need it most. Frank gestured toward the student tanks. "Get everyone back to base, this exercise is over." As the students returned to their vehicles, Nathan lingered for a moment. "You risked your life to stop that tank, to protect us." Frank met the young officer's gaze steadily. "That's what tank commanders do, Lieutenant. We make the hard calls. We take the risks necessary to protect our people. Some things don't change, no matter how advanced the technology becomes." Nathan nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand, sir, better than I did before." The storm began to abate as they made their way back to the base, the weather clearing as suddenly as it had deteriorated. By the time they reached the command center, blue sky was visible again, the desert sun rapidly drying the rain-soaked landscape. Lieutenant Colonel Reed was waiting at the motor pool, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain. When he saw Frank, relief washed over his features, quickly followed by a more complex emotion. Respect mingled with reluctant acknowledgement. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," Reed said as Frank approached. "You could have been killed." "Wouldn't be the first time I've taken that risk," Frank replied. "Nor the last, I expect." Reed's expression turned grave. "The autonomous program has been suspended pending a full investigation. Dr. Chen and her team are analyzing what went wrong, but preliminary assessment indicates a cascading failure triggered by sensor degradation in the extreme weather conditions." "It was a perfect storm," Frank observed, literally and figuratively. But it revealed something important about the limitations of autonomous systems. Their dependence on sensors and communications, their inability to adapt when those systems fail. Reed nodded reluctantly. "Point taken, but this incident doesn't invalidate the program. It highlights areas for improvement, fail-safes that need strengthening, contingencies that need development." "I never said it invalidated the program," Frank clarified, "only that it demonstrates the continuing need for human oversight, for commanders who can make decisions when the algorithms fail, who can take necessary risks when the situation demands it." The two men regarded each other with newfound understanding. They would never fully agree on the future of armored warfare, but the day's events had brought them closer to a shared perspective, a recognition that the path forward might involve integration rather than replacement, human judgment complementing technological capability rather than being supplanted by it. As they walked toward the command center, Frank noticed the students gathered in small groups, discussing the incident with animated gestures and serious expressions. He caught snippets of conversation, reflections on what had happened, questions about the autonomous systems, observations about the critical intervention that had prevented disaster. Nathan Reed stood slightly apart, watching his father and Frank approach. His expression was thoughtful, his posture reflecting a new confidence and clarity of purpose. Whatever doubts he had harbored about the value of human tank commanders had been answered today. Not through arguments or training exercises, but through the reality of crisis and the human response to it. Frank felt a quiet satisfaction as he observed the change in these young officers and NCOs. They had witnessed firsthand both the promise and the peril of autonomous warfare, had seen the limitations of technology and the enduring importance of human judgment in the crucible of near disaster. It wasn't a complete victory. The autonomous program would continue adapting and improving based on the lessons of today's failure. But perhaps it would develop with a greater appreciation for the human element, for the irreplaceable value of commanders who could make decisions based not just on tactical calculations, but on moral intuition and personal courage. For the students of this final tank commander class, the experience would shape their understanding of their role in the evolving landscape of modern warfare. They would carry forward not just technical skills, but a deeper appreciation for the human dimensions of command, the judgment, courage, and responsibility that defined the tank commanders who had come before them. And perhaps, in that transmission of values and understanding, the true legacy of the American Tank Corps would endure, even as the machines themselves transformed into something new and different, not as museum pieces or historical footnotes, but as living traditions embodied in the men and women who carried them forward into an uncertain future. The aftermath of the autonomous tank malfunction reverberated through Fort Irwin like the desert thunderstorms that had triggered it. Frank Harrington stood at the window of the Tactical Operations Center, watching as a recovery vehicle towed the disabled M1X back to the maintenance facility. The once sleek machine now looked oddly vulnerable, its sophisticated systems rendered useless by a combination of bad weather and bullet-damaged electronics. Behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Reed was engaged in an intense conversation with General Williams, the program director who had flown in from the Pentagon following the incident. Their voices were low but tense, the occasional phrase reaching Frank's ears: acceptable risk, system redundancy, revised protocols. The future of the autonomous tank program hung in the balance. Millions of development dollars and countless career trajectories depended on how this failure was interpreted and addressed. Dr. Chen sat at a workstation nearby, her team analyzing data from the malfunctioning vehicle with the grim concentration of surgeons performing an autopsy. Their expressions suggested the news wasn't good, not a simple sensor error or isolated component failure, but a fundamental vulnerability in the system architecture itself. Frank turned as the command center door opened, admitting Jake, Sam, and Bobby. His old crew had been debriefing the students, helping them process what had happened and drawing out the lessons to be learned. "How are they?" Frank asked quietly as his friends joined him. "Shaken," Jake replied, "but in a good way. Nothing like a near-death experience to focus the mind on what really matters." Sam nodded in agreement. "They're asking the right questions now, not just about technical specifications or performance metrics, but about judgment, responsibility, the human element in warfare. Especially young Reed," Bobby added. "Watching you risk your life to stop that runaway tank made quite an impression. He's been grilling us about similar situations we faced, times when we had to make decisions that no algorithm could handle." Frank allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The incident, for all its danger, had accomplished what weeks of conventional training might not have. It had demonstrated viscerally the continuing value of human tank commanders, the limitations of even the most sophisticated autonomous systems. His satisfaction was short-lived. Lieutenant Colonel Reed approached, his expression grave but composed. General Williams followed a step behind, a silver-haired man with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. "Colonel Harrington," Reed began formally, "General Williams would like to speak with you and your team." The general extended his hand. "That was some piece of work yesterday, Colonel. Not many men would have attempted what you did. Fewer still would have succeeded." Frank accepted the handshake. "I did what was necessary, sir. Anyone in my position would have done the same." "I doubt that very much." The general's gaze was penetrating, assessing. Dr. Chen informs me that your unconventional method of deactivating the vehicle has rendered it inoperable for the remainder of this training rotation. The control systems are completely fried. I apologize for the damage, sir. There wasn't time for a more elegant solution. General Williams waved off the apology. The equipment can be replaced. The lives you saved cannot. Which brings me to the reason for my visit. He glanced at Reed. Lieutenant Colonel Reed and I have been discussing the implications of yesterday's incident for both the autonomous vehicle program and this final tank commander class. Frank exchanged glances with his crew, sensing a pivotal moment approaching. The general's next words would determine the direction of their remaining weeks at Fort Irwin. The autonomous program is being temporarily suspended, Williams announced. Not canceled, but paused for comprehensive review and redesign. Dr. Chen and her team will return to the development facility to address the vulnerabilities exposed yesterday. It was a significant concession from the military leadership that had championed the autonomous tanks as the future of armored warfare. Frank kept his expression neutral, waiting for the other shoe to drop. As for this training rotation, Williams continued, it will continue with a modified objective. Instead of simply qualifying these 12 individuals as tank commanders before the transition to autonomous vehicles, you will now be tasked with developing integrated operational concepts, tactics, techniques, and procedures for human-machine teaming in armored warfare. Reed stepped forward. What the general is proposing, Frank, is that we use the remaining 4 weeks to explore a middle path. Not autonomous vehicles replacing human crews, but human commanders working in concert with semi-autonomous systems, leveraging the strengths of each while mitigating the weaknesses. Frank considered the proposition. It wasn't the complete vindication of the human element he might have hoped for, but it was a significant shift from the wholesale replacement that had been planned. Most importantly, it acknowledged the continuing value of human judgment in armored warfare. We can work with that, he said finally, but we'll need to completely redesign the training program. You'll have considerable latitude, General Williams assured him. Lieutenant Colonel Reed will retain formal command of the rotation, but you and your team will take the lead on developing the integrated concepts. You've earned that trust. After the general departed, Frank and Reed found themselves alone in the briefing room, an unexpected moment of privacy in the otherwise bustling command center. Reed seemed different somehow, the rigid certainty of his earlier position softened by the realities they had witnessed. I owe you an apology, Frank, he said finally, not just for the danger my son and the other students were placed in, but for my inflexibility regarding the autonomous program. I was so focused on the technical advantages that I minimized the importance of human judgment. You were doing your job, Frank replied, pursuing what you believed was the best path forward for the Army. There's no shame in that. Perhaps, but there is shame in forgetting the lessons you taught me years ago, about the art of command being as important as the science, about making decisions based not just on data, but on values. Frank studied his former student, seeing echoes of the young officer he had mentored 20 years earlier. Those lessons weren't forgotten, Mark, just temporarily overshadowed by the promise of new technology. It happens to the best of us. Reed smiled faintly. Ever the diplomat, even when you've been proven right. Not entirely right, Frank countered. The autonomous systems have genuine advantages: speed, precision, endurance. The challenge isn't choosing between human or machine, but finding the optimal integration of both, which is exactly what we're now tasked with exploring. Reed extended his hand. Partners in this, Frank? Whatever our past disagreements? Frank accepted the handshake without hesitation. Partners. The next morning, Frank gathered the students in the classroom, sensing their collective anticipation. News of the program's suspension and the revised training objectives had spread quickly, generating speculation and debate among the young officers and NCOs. By now, you've all heard about the changes to our mission, Frank began. The autonomous vehicle program is on hold pending review, and our focus has shifted to developing integrated operational concepts for human-machine teaming. He paused, surveying their attentive faces. Some of you might see this as a victory for the traditional approach to armored warfare. Others might view it as a temporary setback for inevitable technological progress. Both perspectives missed the point. Frank moved to the center of the room, ensuring he had their complete attention. The point is that armored warfare, like all aspects of military operations, continues to evolve. From the first tanks that rolled across the battlefields of World War I to the sophisticated machines you command today, the fundamental principles have remained constant while the implementation has transformed. He gestured toward a display showing historical images of tank warfare through the decades. Each generation faced the challenge of incorporating new technologies without losing the essential human qualities that make the difference between victory and defeat. Our generation is no different. The students listened intently as Frank outlined the revised training program. Instead of simply qualifying as conventional tank commanders, they would now explore various models of human-machine integration, testing different distributions of responsibility between human judgment and autonomous systems. We'll be writing the playbook for the next generation of armored warfare, he explained, determining which decisions should remain exclusively human, which can be safely delegated to autonomous systems, and how commanders should supervise and intervene when necessary. The announcement energized the class. Even those who had been most enthusiastic about the autonomous program recognized the historic opportunity they had been given to shape the future of armored warfare rather than simply witnessing its transformation from the sidelines. Nathan Reed approached Frank after the briefing, his expression reflecting the general excitement but tempered by personal concerns. "My father asked me to join him for dinner tonight," he said. "First time since the training rotation began. I think he wants to discuss what happened, maybe explain his position." Frank nodded understandingly. "Good, you should hear his perspective. He's still your commander and your father." "That's just it, sir. The lines have gotten blurred. Is he talking to me as my commanding officer, my father, or the autonomous program advocate? I'm not sure how to approach the conversation." Frank considered his response carefully. His instinct was to offer advice, but he recognized this as an important moment in Nathan's development as an officer, learning to navigate complex personal and professional relationships. "Listen first," he suggested finally. "Understand his position before presenting your own. Remember that good officers can disagree on tactics or technology while respecting each other's underlying motivations. And above all, separate the personal from the professional. He's your father before he's your commander." Nathan nodded, seeming to find the guidance helpful. "Thank you, sir, for everything. What you did out there, stopping that tank." He trailed off, struggling to articulate the impact of Frank's actions. "Just doing my job, Lieutenant. The same job you're training for. Making the hard calls when lives are on the line." As Nathan departed, Frank turned his attention to the immediate challenges of restructuring the training program. With Reed's approval, he reorganized the schedule to incorporate intensive exploration of human-machine teaming concepts. Jake would lead sessions on integrated fire control systems, Sam on coordinated logistics and ammunition handling, Bobby on hybrid propulsion and mobility tactics. Frank himself would focus on command philosophy and decision authority, the critical question of when and how human judgment should override autonomous systems. The following weeks saw a transformation in the training atmosphere, with the competitive tension between human and autonomous approaches replaced by collaborative exploration. The students engaged with renewed enthusiasm. They formed smaller working groups, each exploring different aspects of integrated operations, then came together to share insights and test concepts in increasingly sophisticated exercises. Frank observed these developments with satisfaction, particularly noting Nathan Reed's emergence as a natural leader among his peers. The young lieutenant combined his father's analytical precision with an intuitive understanding of the human dimension that Frank had emphasized throughout the training. When Nathan led simulated operations integrating human judgment with semi-autonomous systems, the results consistently exceeded performance metrics for either approach used in isolation. Lieutenant Colonel Reed noticed as well. Frank often caught him watching his son during exercises, pride evident in his expression despite his professional reserve. Whatever private conversations had occurred between father and son seemed to have bridged their philosophical differences, at least to the extent that each could appreciate the other's perspective. As the training rotation entered its final week, General Williams returned to Fort Irwin, accompanied by a delegation of senior officers and defense officials. The work of Frank's students had attracted attention at the highest levels, their integrated operational concepts representing a potential breakthrough in the long-running debate over the future of armored warfare. "They want a demonstration," Reed informed Frank after meeting with the general. "A full-scale exercise implementing your integrated concepts, something that showcases the optimal balance between human judgment and autonomous capability." Frank recognized both the opportunity and the risk. The autonomous vehicles are still non-operational. Dr. Chen's team took them back to the development facility. They're returning tomorrow with 2 modified units, limited autonomy, enhanced safety protocols, and most importantly, robust human override capabilities. Reed handed Frank a technical specification document. They're calling it the Centaur configuration. Not fully autonomous, but not conventional either. A true hybrid. Frank studied the specifications with growing interest. The modified vehicles retained their advanced sensor arrays and targeting systems, but required human authorization for weapons release. They could navigate independently, but would defer to human judgment in complex or ambiguous situations. It wasn't perfect, but it represented a genuine attempt to combine the precision of machines with the judgment of human operators. We can work with this, he decided, a combined operation with conventional tanks and these Centaur units. Something that demonstrates the advantages of integration over either approach in isolation. Reed nodded in agreement. What did you have in mind? The Ridge Complex scenario. Multiple objective areas, diverse terrain, civilian presence, electronic warfare conditions. The full spectrum of modern combat challenges. Reed looked impressed. Ambitious, that scenario that has never been completed successfully by either conventional or autonomous forces alone. Exactly, which makes it the perfect demonstration of what integrated operations can achieve. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of preparation. The students were organized into 3 combined platoons, each consisting of 2 conventional tanks and 1 Centaur vehicle. Frank assigned Nathan Reed to command the lead platoon, with the most challenging sector of the operation. The other platoons were led by Staff Sergeant Chen and Lieutenant Ramirez, both of whom had demonstrated exceptional aptitude for integrated operations. Dr. Chen returned with the modified autonomous vehicles, now reprogrammed to operate in the Centaur configuration. She worked closely with Frank's team to ensure the human operators understood the system's capabilities and limitations, particularly the override protocols that would allow them to intervene if the automation made questionable decisions. It's not perfect, she acknowledged during a planning session. The integration is still experimental. The interface is rudimentary. But it's a start, a genuine attempt to combine the best of both approaches. Frank appreciated her candor. Perfect isn't the objective. Effective is. Can your systems work within these parameters? Accept human guidance when the situation demands it? They can. The question is whether your human commanders can effectively supervise systems that process information and execute actions far faster than human cognition allows. It was a fair question, one that went to the heart of the integrated operational concept. Frank had been wrestling with it throughout the training rotation, developing protocols and interfaces that would allow human commanders to maintain meaningful control without becoming bottlenecks in the decision cycle. We've designed the command relationships to focus human attention on key decision points, he explained. The machines handle routine operations autonomously while flagging complex or ambiguous situations for human judgment. It's not about humans micromanaging every action, but about ensuring critical decisions reflect our values and priorities. The day of the demonstration arrived with perfect desert weather, clear skies, and moderate temperatures providing ideal conditions for both human crews and electronic systems. The VIP delegation assembled in the observation center overlooking the vast training range, where large displays showed the position and status of each vehicle in the operation. Lieutenant Colonel Reed briefed the visitors on the exercise parameters, while Frank made final preparations with the student commanders. The Ridge Complex scenario would test every aspect of their training: tactical movement, target discrimination, coordinated fires, adaptability to changing conditions, and most importantly, effective integration of human judgment with autonomous capabilities. Remember what you've learned these past weeks, Frank told them in a final briefing. Trust the autonomous systems to do what they do best: process information, execute precise movements, maintain situational awareness across the battle space. But never surrender your authority as commanders. When moral judgment is required, when the situation falls outside parameters, that's where you make the difference. The student has listened with the focused attention of warriors preparing for battle. Though this was a training exercise, they understood its significance, not just for their own careers, but for the future of armored warfare. They would be writing the first chapter in a new operational doctrine, setting precedents that might influence military development for decades to come. Nathan Reed approached Frank as the others departed for their vehicles. "Thank you, sir, for everything you've taught us. Whatever happens today, we wouldn't be here without your guidance." Frank clasped the young lieutenant's shoulder. "You've earned this opportunity, Nathan. All of you have. Now go show them what integrated operations can achieve." The exercise began with the combined force moving out from assembly areas toward their initial objectives. From the observation center, Frank watched with professional pride as his students implemented the tactics they had developed, the conventional tanks and Centaur vehicles operating in coordinated harmony. Nathan Reed's platoon led the advance, navigating the challenging terrain with a combination of human intuition and machine precision. The conventional tanks took the lead in complex urban environments, where human judgment was essential for discriminating between combatants and civilians. The Centaur vehicle provided overwatch from elevated positions, its superior sensors detecting threats beyond human visual range. "Impressive coordination," General Williams observed as the operation progressed. "The autonomous systems are enhancing capability without replacing human decision-making." Lieutenant Colonel Reed nodded in agreement. "The key innovation is the decision architecture, clearly defined responsibilities, transparent automation, meaningful human oversight. It preserves the essential role of the tank commander while leveraging the advantages of autonomous systems." Frank listened to this exchange with quiet satisfaction. Reed had fully embraced the integrated approach, his earlier advocacy for full autonomy replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the complementary relationship between human and machine. The exercise continued to unfold successfully as the combined force secured their initial objectives and pushed deeper into enemy territory. Each type of vehicle played to its strengths, the Centaur units excelling in open terrain where their superior sensors and targeting systems could be fully utilized. The conventional tanks dominating in complex environments where human judgment and adaptability were paramount. Then came the moment Frank had been anticipating, the electronic warfare phase of the scenario. Simulated enemy jammers activated across the battle space, degrading communications and sensor capabilities. In previous iterations of this exercise, both conventional and autonomous forces had struggled under these conditions, their effectiveness severely compromised by the loss of coordination and situational awareness. But the integrated force responded differently. The human commanders adapted immediately to the communications degradation, falling back on visual signals and pre-planned contingencies. The autonomous systems, though hampered by electronic interference, continued to function within their core parameters, providing essential support even with reduced capability. Nathan Reed's platoon encountered the heaviest electronic warfare effects as they approached the final objective. Frank watched intently as the young lieutenant implemented the protocols they had developed for precisely this situation. Instead of attempting to maintain full electronic coordination, Reed shifted to a hybrid command model, using visual signals to direct the conventional tanks while issuing simplified mission commands to the Centaur unit. The approach worked beautifully. Despite the electronic interference, the platoon maintained cohesion and combat effectiveness, adapting to the degraded environment without losing momentum toward their objective. "That's the key," Frank explained to the observing officials. "Resilience through integration. Neither fully human nor fully autonomous, but a flexible combination that can adapt to changing conditions." When electronics are degraded, human judgment and visual coordination take precedence. When humans are under stress or overloaded, autonomous systems provide continuity and precision. General Williams nodded thoughtfully. "A compelling demonstration, Colonel Harrington. But the real test comes now, the final objective with the civilian presence scenario. That's where previous autonomous systems have struggled most significantly." The general was right. The final phase of the exercise involves securing an objective with simulated civilian presence, requiring complex ethical judgments that autonomous systems typically handled poorly. It was here that Frank expected the human element to prove most decisively valuable. Nathan Reed's platoon approached the final objective cautiously, the Centaur vehicle's sensors providing detailed information about the target area, while the human commanders interpreted the complex situation. Role players acting as civilians moved throughout the objective, some carrying objects that could be mistaken for weapons, others engaging in behaviors that might be misinterpreted as hostile. Previous iterations of fully autonomous systems had either frozen in decision paralysis when faced with such ambiguity or made catastrophic errors in target identification. Human crews, while better at distinguishing genuine threats, often advance too cautiously, missing tactical opportunities while trying to ensure civilian safety. The integrated approach taken by Nathan's platoon showed a different pattern. The Centaur vehicle provided continuous sensor data, identifying potential threats, and classifying them according to established parameters. But final engagement decisions remained firmly with the human commanders, who interpreted the sensor data through the lens of ethical judgment and contextual understanding. The result was a remarkable balance of tactical effectiveness and ethical constraint. The platoon secured the objective efficiently, neutralizing genuine threats while protecting civilians, even those whose behavior or appearance might have triggered engagement by autonomous systems operating independently. As the exercise concluded successfully, applause broke out in the observation center. The visiting officials exchanged impressed glances, clearly recognizing the significance of what they had witnessed. It wasn't just a training demonstration, but a potential paradigm shift in the approach to armored warfare, a third way beyond the binary choice of human versus machine. General Williams turned to Frank and Reed, his expression reflecting both surprise and satisfaction. "Gentlemen, I think you've just shown us the future of armored warfare. Not replacement, but integration. Not competition, but collaboration between human judgment and autonomous capability." The after-action review that followed was unusually animated, with the visiting officials engaging directly with the student commanders, probing their experiences and insights from the exercise. Nathan Reed fielded questions with quiet confidence, articulating the integrated operational concept with clarity and conviction. The key insight, he explained to an assistant secretary of defense, isn't that humans are better than machines or vice versa. It's that different types of decisions require different cognitive strengths. Machines excel at rapid processing of sensor data, pattern recognition, precision execution of defined procedures. Humans excel at contextual understanding, ethical judgment, creative problem solving in novel situations. The optimal approach integrates both. Frank listened with pride as his students, particularly Nathan, demonstrated not just technical proficiency, but a sophisticated understanding of the philosophical dimensions of their profession. They had grasped the essence of what he had been trying to impart throughout the training, that the human element in warfare wasn't an unfortunate limitation to be engineered away, but a vital component of military effectiveness and ethical conduct. As the review concluded, General Williams made an unexpected announcement. "Based on what we've witnessed today, I'm authorizing an extension of this program. The 67th Armored Regiment will not be deactivated as scheduled. Instead, it will be redesignated as the 67th Integrated Armor Regiment, serving as the test bed for this new operational concept." The announcement sent a ripple of surprise and excitement through the assembled officers. Frank exchanged glances with Reed, both men recognizing the significance of this decision. The 67th would continue its proud lineage, not as a relic of the past, but as a pioneer of the future. Furthermore, the general continued, all 12 students in this final class will be offered positions in the reorganized regiment, applying the integrated concepts they have helped develop. Lieutenant Colonel Reed will remain in command, with Colonel Harrington and his team serving as special advisors during the transition. It was more than Frank could have hoped for, not just validation of the integrated approach, but an opportunity to continue shaping its development. The 67th would live on, evolving rather than ending, carrying forward the traditions and values of American tank warfare into a new technological era. Later that evening, Frank found himself alone in the motor pool, drawn to the tanks that had played such a central role in his life. Tiger Lura 1 stood silently in the gathering dusk, its desert tan paint catching the last golden light of the setting sun. Frank placed a hand on the composite armor, feeling the day's accumulated heat radiating through the metal. "Quite a day," a voice said behind him. Frank turned to find Lieutenant Colonel Reed approaching, his formal demeanor softened by the day's successes. "Quite a day indeed," Frank agreed. "Congratulations on the new command. The 67th Integrated Armor Regiment has a nice ring to it." Reed smiled, joining Frank beside the tank. "I never expected this outcome when the rotation began. I was fully committed to the autonomous transition, convinced it represented the only viable future for armored warfare. And now I understand there's a middle path, one that preserves what's valuable from the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. Reed ran a hand along the tank's hull, a gesture of respect for the machine and what it represented. You were right about the human element, Frank. Not entirely right. The autonomous systems have genuine advantages that can't be dismissed. But right about the continuing value of human judgment, especially in complexity or ambiguous situations. We were both partly right, Frank acknowledged, which is usually how progress happens. Not through revolutionary breaks with the past, but through evolutionary integration of new capabilities with enduring principles. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two career soldiers contemplating the machine that had defined their professional lives. Though separated by rank and generation, they shared a profound understanding of what tanks represented. Not just military hardware, but a tradition of service, sacrifice, and comradeship that transcended the technology itself. Nathan has requested assignment to the conventional element of the regiment, Reed said finally, commanding a human-crewed tank rather than supervising autonomous systems. I've approved his request. Frank nodded, unsurprised by the choice. He'll make an exceptional tank commander. He has the right balance of technical proficiency and moral intuition. Like his father at that age? Reed asked with a hint of self-deprecation. Better, Frank replied honestly. He has your analytical mind, but a deeper appreciation for the human dimensions of command. The best of both approaches, you might say. Reed accepted the assessment with a thoughtful nod. I've requested that you and your team stay on beyond the transition phase. The 67th will need your expertise as we develop these integrated concepts into formal doctrine. It was a generous offer, one that would allow Frank to continue contributing to the evolution of armored warfare rather than simply observing it from retirement. But even as he considered it, he knew his answer. I appreciate the offer, Mark, truly, but my time in uniform is ending. This final mission was exactly that. Final. It's time for the next generation to take the lead. Frank gestured toward the tanks where Nathan and the other students were completing their end-of-day procedures. They're ready. You've all seen to that. Reed seemed disappointed but not surprised. Will you at least consider periodic consulting? Special advisor status, civilian capacity. The 67th shouldn't lose your experience entirely. That I can agree to. Periodic visits, consultation on specific issues. But the day-to-day development belongs to you and these young officers and NCOs. They'll take it places neither of us can fully imagine. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Jake, Sam, and Bobby, Frank's old crew coming to join them by Tiger Door 1. The four men who had served together through so many deployments, who had faced death and achieved victory side by side, gathered one last time around the machine that had been their home and workplace. General Williams has approved a special ceremony, Reed informed them, tomorrow morning before you depart. A formal recognition of your contribution to this program and to the evolution of armored warfare. Frank exchanged glances with his crew, seeing in their expressions the same mixture of pride and melancholy he felt himself. Their final mission was concluding successfully, beyond their most optimistic expectations. The 67th would continue, the traditions and values they cherished preserved even as the technology evolved. But their own active participation was ending, the torch passing to a new generation. We'll be there, Frank assured Reed. One last formation with the 67th. The ceremony the following morning was held on the parade ground, with all 12 student tanks arranged in formal review formation. The newly designated Centaur vehicles were positioned alongside them, symbolic of the integrated approach that would define the regiment's future operations. General Williams presented Frank and his team with the Distinguished Service Medal, recognizing their exceptional contribution to military innovation. The citation praised not just their technical expertise, but their commitment to preserving the human dimensions of warfare amidst rapid technological change. Colonel Harrington and his team have demonstrated that progress comes not from choosing between tradition and innovation, but from integrating the best of both, the general declared. The operational concepts they helped develop will influence armored warfare for generations to come, ensuring that human judgment and ethical considerations remain central even as technology advances. Frank accepted the medal with professional modesty, but his true reward came in the faces of the students standing at attention before him. They had arrived 6 weeks earlier as talented but uncertain officers and NCOs, unsure of their place in a military transitioning toward autonomous systems. They departed as confident tank commanders with a clear understanding of their enduring value in the evolution of armored warfare. As the ceremony concluded, Nathan Reed approached Frank with a formal salute. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Frank returned the salute. "Always, Lieutenant. I wanted to thank you personally, not just for the training, but for helping me understand what it truly means to be a tank commander. The responsibility, the judgment, the moral weight of the decisions we make. I wouldn't have grasped that without your guidance." "You would have found your way eventually," Frank assured him. "You have good instincts, Lieutenant. Trust them." Nathan nodded, then hesitated briefly before continuing. "My father and I have had some long conversations these past weeks about his career, his evolution from conventional tank officer to autonomous program advocate, and now to this integrated approach. It's helped me understand him better, both as a commander and as a father." Frank was pleased to hear it. The reconciliation between father and son, between traditional and innovative approaches to warfare, represented everything he had hoped to achieve in this final mission. "Keep the dialogue going," he advised. "The best solutions emerge from the tension between different perspectives, from the constant questioning and refinement of our assumptions. That's true in warfare and in family relationships." Nathan accepted the wisdom with a thoughtful nod. "Will you be back to visit the regiment once we're fully operational with the integrated concept?" "Count on it," Frank promised. "I want to see where you take this, how you evolve these initial concepts into mature doctrine. This is just the beginning of a new chapter for the 67th. After saying his goodbyes to the students and staff, Frank found himself once more beside Tigers 01, preparing for final departure. Jake, Sam, and Bobby joined him, each man touching the tank in his own way, a gesture of respect and farewell to the machine that had been such a significant part of their lives. "Hard to believe it's over," Sam said quietly. "This final mission, our active service, feels like the end of an era." "Not an ending," Frank corrected him. "A transition. The 67th continues. The traditions we upheld, the values we embodied, they live on in these young officers and NCOs. In the integrated approach they'll develop in the years ahead." Bobby nodded in agreement. "And in that kid, Nathan Reed, he's got the makings of an exceptional tank commander. Maybe even better than his old man." "Definitely better than his old man," Jake affirmed. "He understands what Mark forgot somewhere along the way, that it's not just about technical performance or tactical efficiency. It's about judgment, responsibility, the human dimensions of command." Frank listened to his friends with quiet satisfaction. They had accomplished what they set out to do, not just training the final class of tank commanders, but ensuring that the spirit and traditions of the American Tank Corps would endure, even as the technology evolved beyond anything they had operated in their own careers. Lieutenant Colonel Reed approached as they prepared to board the transport helicopter that would take them back to Fort Moore. "It's been an honor, Frank," he said, extending his hand. "We started this rotation as philosophical opponents. We ended as partners in a new vision for armored warfare." Frank accepted the handshake warmly. "Take care of the 67th, Mark, and take care of those young officers and NCOs. They're the future now." "I will, and I'll keep you informed of our progress. This integrated concept we've developed, it has potential far beyond what we've demonstrated so far." As the helicopter lifted off, Frank gazed down at the sprawling training facility below. The tanks of the 67th, both conventional and Centaur variants, were moving out for another exercise, continuing the development of the integrated operational concept that would define the regiment's future. It wasn't the outcome he had initially hoped for when accepting this final mission. It was better. The 67th would continue, not as a museum piece preserving outdated traditions, but as a living laboratory for the evolution of armored warfare. The human element would remain central, not in opposition to technological advancement, but integrated with it, each enhancing the other's capabilities. Jake leaned over, raising his voice above the rotor noise. "So, retirement for real this time? Golf courses and fishing trips?" Frank smiled but shook his head. "Periodic consulting with the 67th. Maybe some writing. There's a book about tank warfare and the human element that needs to be written. And time with family, of course." "No regrets?" Sam asked. Frank looked out at the desert landscape passing beneath them, thinking of the 40 years he had dedicated to the Army, to tanks, to the development of officers and NCOs who would carry forward the traditions he valued. He thought of the young commanders they had just trained, particularly Nathan Reed, who would take the integrated concept places he could only imagine. No regrets, he answered honestly. We did what we set out to do. We ensured that when the history of American tank warfare is written, it doesn't end with our generation, but continues through the next, preserving what matters most while embracing necessary change. The helicopter banked, turning eastward toward their final destination. Frank settled back in his seat, surrounded by the friends who had shared his final mission, content in the knowledge that the legacy they had fought to preserve would endure. Not as a static monument to the past, but as a living tradition evolving to meet the challenges of the future. The human element in armored warfare, the judgment, courage, and camaraderie that had defined tank crews since they first rolled across the battlefields of World War I, would continue integrated with new technologies, but never replaced by them. And in that continuation, Frank Harrington found the perfect conclusion to his 40 years of service. Not an ending, but a transition. Not a farewell, but a passing of the torch. The steel valor that had defined his generation would live on in the next, adapting to new challenges but remaining essentially, immutably human.